All right, Sean, now for our main topic. Last month, we talked all about a movie trilogy, the recent Halloween trilogy. This month, we're talking about something more fun, less recent, but I think it is going to be an even better thing to talk about, and that is the Gamera Heisei Trilogy from the 90s, which you have wanted to do a podcast on for like 10 years? I don't know. How fucking long have you been wanting to do this?
A very long time. I think it's been ever since whenever the first time we did a Kaiju podcast probably was when I was like, oh, we should do those Gamera movies. Those are really good. Because I think at some point, like 10-something years ago, you asked me, like, oh, what are some other good, like, Kaiju movies, if you're someone who hasn't seen a lot of them, that are, like, what's, like, would be your recommendation? And this is my recommendation to basically anyone. If you want to get into this genre, these are the best movies to watch. Because they're some of the best movies.
I would 100% agree. I'm looking it up right now, Sean, and our first Godzilla-focused episode was Weekly Stuff 162 from October 10th, 2016. So before the first Trump election, we were talking about Gamera a little bit, and it took this long for you to get me to watch these for a podcast topic. But I am glad, because, Sean, I completely agree. I think these movies rock. I think the first movie is, like, the most perfect kaiju movie entry point I could imagine. It is in terms of just a fun, entertaining, not like heavy kaiju movie like Godzilla -1 or the original Godzilla, but like one that is like a popcorn kaiju movie. It's the best version of that I've ever seen. Yeah. And then I think movies 2 and 3 go in really interesting other directions. And I think these movies, like, for me, were fascinating because they predate and I think anticipate a bunch of interesting trends. Like, obviously, Shin Godzilla is super influenced by these because of Shinji Higuchi. And like the effects are like, you can really see a line. Like, boy, Shinji Higuchi likes putting weird googly eyes on his monsters. Yep. You have that here, you have that in Shin Godzilla. But I think the Universal, the legendary MonsterVerse movies, like King Kong versus Godzilla, or I think they call it Godzilla vs. Kong, whatever. But Godzilla King of the Monsters, all of those are more influenced by these Gamera movies, I think, than like any Godzilla movies. Like, their view on Godzilla is this series' view on Gamera. And I also think these movies, I wish everyone making superhero movies in the US would watch these, because these are a model for how, I know Gamera isn't based on a comic book, but these are the most perfect comic book movies ever.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's what, like, that first movie in particular has to do the thing that all superhero movies have to do, which is introduce your superhero character and introduce your villain and have them fight and have a satisfying conclusion all in one 90 to 100 minute long movie. And it does it absolutely perfectly. Yeah, absolutely. Like, these movies, I kind of grew up watching these a little bit. I came to them a little bit later than, like, the Godzilla movies, like Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, which I watched when I was, like, 4 years old or something. I probably picked up the VHS tape of Gamera 1, or Gamera Guardian of the Universe, when I was, like, 10 years old or something, and that is one of my most watched VHS tapes ever. Is the VHS for this first Gamera movie. And then it was a long time before I was able to see 2 and 3. Because they were not as easy to find back then. But yeah, these movies are so good, and they just, as you say, are like a model for how to do this kind of movie, whether it's giant monsters or it's superheroes. Because Gamera is basically a superhero monster. That's kind of the idea behind him. And I think filmmakers should study these movies, but also these movies are, like, hugely influential within the weird niche genre of giant monster films. And all of the giant monster movies, like the Godzilla movies of the 2000s, are hugely influenced by this. And then, all the modern ones are in one form or another. Obviously, we haven't gotten a Japanese, like, versus movie from the new Godzilla movies yet, but Shin Godzilla and Godzilla -1, in terms of the filmmaking, are hugely inspired by how this handles its, like, how do you shoot giant monster stuff? Even if these are not really CG monsters, they're still giant suits. What this team sort of innovated in terms of how to shoot those things, how to do, like, kind of grounded camera angles, that's all really comes from these movies. And that's how all the modern giant monster movies are shot, are like scenes from these Gamera films. So I've just been really, really wanting to talk about these for a long time, and I'm so excited. Finally, the opportunity has come around.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the, like, Millennium-era Godzilla movies, because that's the era of Godzilla I've seen the most of. I think I've seen almost all, like, -1 or 2 of the Millennium movies. Yeah. And I think you can see the influence. I mean, literally, Shusuke Kaneko directed GMK. But, like, I think these are better than any of those. Like, and I like the Millennium Godzilla movies, but these are a step above that. These are some of the best special effects in film history. Like, the first one especially, show me literally any Hollywood movie from the 90s, these movies have better special effects. They just do. They just do. I don't care. Like Jurassic Park has great special effects, but sometimes the CGI dinosaurs don't look as good as these suits. So, it's like any movie. These are so cool. They don't feel like dated in any way. They still feel, I think, very current, even though they're now almost 30 years old. But I think it's because, like, the last 30 years has been a lot of other movies catching up to them in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And the other thing that's really refreshing about them is, like, there's just not a lot of giant monster movies that aren't Godzilla, And then obviously you have, like, on TV, you've got Ultraman, but Gamera gets to be its own unique flavor, and there are things that Gamera can do that Godzilla can never do. Like, you can try to...
Like, he can spin really fast as a turtle and go... That's not what you mean, but okay.
Yeah, I meant more like, in terms of the lore and the setting and the characterization, right? Like, you can try to twist Godzilla into the Guardian of Children kind of shape as much as you want, but he never fully takes to it. Even in the goofy Showa era movies where they try to do that as hard as they can, there's, Godzilla still is a walking natural disaster. He still has his roots in the nuclear bomb. Like, you just can't fully remove it from Godzilla, no matter how hard you try. And like Gamera just doesn't have that problem. So there are things that these movies are able to do narratively. There are things they're able to do by having a more of a fantasy kind of edge to them, particularly for the first and third one, and just being kind of not hooked into the specifics of the history of the Godzilla franchise allows these movies to do things you just don't get to see in other giant monster movies. That's one of the things that's so fun about them, is you just get to see a different vision of what the genre could be like if it wasn't so attached to a singular IP. As much as I adore that IP of Godzilla, it's nice to see something being able to explore different boundaries of what this world of giant monster kaiju movies can do. And the Gamera films, or these Gamera films in particular, are like the absolute best that could ever, I think, really be done.
They're also a closed trilogy. Like, that's also something that Godzilla can never really do. Like, you can have one-off Godzilla movies, and you can have kind of loose continuities, but you very rarely have a firm, like, these are the three movies, there's a beginning, middle, and end. Gamera ends on kind of the story goes on note, but it is still a clear, like, thematic conclusion to the trilogy, and you can watch these three and have a full experience. And I don't know of any other example of that in, like, kaiju world.
No, yeah, there's really not. I mean, you've got like kind of your the Mothra Heisei movies that they made, which are a little bit closer to that, but nothing that's as clean as these Gamera movies. And there's part of it is also there's just the consistency of the creative team, which is the same across all three films. That's also a real rarity. It's very unusual, particularly once you get out of the Showa era, to have such consistency in terms of the production crew on these kinds of films. In the Heisei era Godzilla and the Millennium Godzilla movies, you switch it up pretty frequently. Every like other movie or so, you'd have a pretty radical overhaul of people behind the camera. And here it's the same people, the same consistent crew all the way through all three films.
Yeah. Well, Sean, you have collected a very big historical document, and I definitely, after watching these, wanted to learn a lot more about Gamera. So I'm just ready to sit back and learn all about this amazing Atlantean turtle monster robot thing.
Yes. All right. So let's dig into the history here. So let's start just with a little bit of background of where does Gamera come from before these movies, because obviously he is a much older character than these three films. So Gamera was created in 1965 by the studio Daiei Films. As a way to capitalize on the kaiju movie boom, which was obviously precipitated by Toho's Godzilla in 1954, and Toho's like whole range of other giant monster movies. Like Toho basically owned the kaiju genre on film, and so Daiei was like, we want to get in on that. You also had the Ultraman franchise on TV, as well as like various other things. Like in the late 50s through the 60s, the kaiju genre was just huge in Japan. But again, Toho had a real death grip on it in film. Daiei wanted some of that scratch. So they had a bunch...
Daiei is an older studio. Toho is a younger studio. And Daiei is kind of like looking at these upstarts of Toho and Toei doing their thing in the 60s also. I mean, like, how do we get with the moment? And I do love that their answer to that was Gamera.
Yes. Well, the Gamera was their later answer. They had a couple...
Yes.
They had a couple of attempts to get the giant monster thing off, and it didn't really work. So in the early 60s, they had a couple of sort of aborted attempts to do giant monster movies, starting with Dakura, which would have been a giant octopus monster. If you don't know Japanese, taco is Japanese for octopus, and you just turn that T into a D, and you get Dakura. And obviously the Ra, that just comes from Gojira. That's like every random monster. If you can't come up with a monster name in Japanese, you just throw Ra on the end of it to evoke Godzilla and you're good. So Dakura, that didn't work out. Then they tried Nezura, which would have been a giant rat monster. And there's a whole big legacy of that movie where its production was shut down by the health department because they were using actual rats on miniature sets, and those rats were infested with fleas. And so the health department was like, we cannot make this movie. And so that movie's production got shut down. There was a crowd-funded documentary about that movie made years later, I think called Nezra 1964. And you can find that if you want to. I have not actually seen it, but I'm sure it goes into good
right
details.
Fucking now. So the movie was never finished?
Yeah, the movie was never made.
Wow.
It started production. I think it fairly quickly ended its production. And so they never completed Nezra.
You can watch Nezra 1964 for free on Tubi right now. So,
there you go.
There you go.
If you want to learn more about Nezra, the giant monster that never was, you can go watch that. And I just want to say, giant rat monster, bad idea. Like, regardless of the flea-infested production, it's just the giant rat monster does not have the appeal of giant, like, dinosaur, like Godzilla, or a giant, like, snake, or whatever.
I'm just thinking of the giant rat at the end of The Talons of Wang Chiang, the Doctor Who episode.
Yes.
It's at part 1, and it's, like, the worst special effect in all of Doctor Who, which is saying something. And I'm just like, a whole movie of that.
Yeah, so Nezra didn't work out. In the wake of that aborted production, which all that happened in 1964, then president of Daiei Film, Nagata Masaichi, came up with the idea of a giant turtle monster, and he brought that idea to the director of Nezra, who was a rookie director at the time, Yuasa Noriaki. And he said, hey, why don't we just do a giant turtle monster? The octopus didn't work out. The rat, which is Nezumi, that didn't work out. So let's do a turtle, a kame, or let's call him Gamera. And that's where they actually got the proper Gamera started. So they made that movie in 1965, Gamera the Giant Monster, as it's known in Japan, or Gamera Daikaiju, or Gamera the Invincible with 2 M's on Gamera, which is its original English title over here. Because remember, these movies were not just big in Japan, they were really popular over here as well. So all of them got like edited English dubbed versions that came out in theaters over here also, and Gamera was no exception. So if you want to see like very goofy English dub versions that have like 5 to 6 minutes cut out at random places, sometimes with weird English actor shot scenes edited in, those movies exist as well in their English version, like Gamera the Invincible. Daiei would go on to make 6 more Gamera movies from 1966 to 1971. It's about 1 movie a year, which is very common for the kind of pace of production for these kinds of films. And all of them, with the exception of one of them, were directed by Yuasa Noriaki. While the Gamera films never received the same level of financial or critical success as Godzilla, they were useful and surprising successes for Daiei Film, which was really struggling at this time. And Gamera was like one of their sort of few kind of bright spots in their portfolio through the late 60s. The Gamera series really saw a lot of success starting with the second movie, which is when they started targeting that younger demographic. And so when you think of Gamera and the idea of Gamera as being like the children's hero and the guardian of children, that idea is sort of vaguely present in the first film, but it's really a bigger fixation in the second one. And the second Gamera movie is where that kind of idea of Gamera gets set in place and then is more consistent from then on. Alongside this, Gamera was depicted as, that heroic type character, and that's the thing that helped differentiate him from other monsters at the time. Though you do have to sort of put it in perspective of the whole genre was moving in this direction, and Gamera was just kind of ahead of the curve by doing that. So Godzilla as a franchise really moved to the Godzilla's kind of a hero, and you have a lot of kind of kid characters in the movies. That started in 1967 with the son of Godzilla. And then, of course, you also have the Ultraman franchise beginning in 1966. The Ultraman franchise very much is our guy is a giant hero. I mean, he's just a superhero. And we also have kids as the main characters, or as a main character, at least on the crew. Every Ultraman show has a kid in the 60s who is one of the main characters. So that's like Gamera. I think the genre would have gone that way anyways, regardless of Gamera, but it was like ahead of the curve of pushing in that direction and helped push that sort of overall genre into this more kind of child-focused mode. In 1971, though, Daiei Film did go into bankruptcy, and that, of course, put a halt to the Gamera franchise. There was a planned 8th Gamera movie in production, but it never saw the light of day because the whole studio went bankrupt. So you can't really make a movie in those conditions. In 1974, Daiei Film was purchased by Tokuma Shoten, which is a literature publishing company. That's not even a film company. And they sort of turned Daiei Film into quote unquote new Daiei, and they began production on a new Gamera film under that label, which had a very troubled production and did not release until 1980 as the movie Gamera Super Monster. Gamera Super Monster is infamous as one of the worst kaiju movies kind of ever. It was made on an incredibly cheap budget. Almost all of the effects work in that movie is just stock footage from earlier Gamera films, so there's almost no footage of like new giant monster stuff. And so that movie was sort of cobbled together in a desperate bid to try to deal with the financial situation around Daiei. But the movie was a massive flop, especially because by 1980, the kaiju genre was basically dead in the water. Godzilla was not putting out movies at that point. The Ultraman franchise had gone on hiatus for a while and then had its last sort of Hail Mary with Ultraman 80, and that series very much did not work out. And so this was a very bad giant monster movie coming out when no other giant monster movies were coming out. And so Gamera Super Monster, just complete and massive and utter bomb.
I also read that Gamera Super Monster has stock footage not just from Gamera, but from the animated movies Space Battleship Yamato and Galaxy Express 999. I need to see this movie. It sounds fucking fascinating. Not good, but fascinating.
It's a Frankenstein's monster of a movie, for sure. It's wild. So Gamera then, after Gamera Super Monster, went on hiatus throughout all of the 1980s, and this is what happened to the broad kaiju genre, right? In the late 1970s is when anime really kind of picked up and became a huge kind of media storm in Japan. And so a lot of that younger demographic that was the demographic for kaiju films was now going and watching movies like Space Battleship Yamato at the movie theater, or Mobile Suit Gundam in the Mobile Suit Gundam movies. And so the kaiju genre went away for a very, very long time. And that's where we now start to shift out of the Showa era and into the Heisei era. And for people who don't know, when we talk about that in relation to giant monster movies, we're just talking about like the historical Japanese era in which they were made. And so whenever Japan has a new emperor come in, they sort of have a new era. And so you had the Showa era for a long time. In the early or late, I think it's like 1989, I believe, is when Heisei begins. And then right now we're in the Reiwa era. So that's what we're talking about when we're using those era terms. So the Godzilla franchise had been on hiatus since Terror of Mechagodzilla in, I think that's 75 or 76. And then they brought Godzilla back briefly in 1984 with the movie Return of Godzilla. That sort of eventually would produce a longer series of sequels starting in 1989 with Godzilla vs. Biollante. So this is where we now have the Heisei era of Godzilla movies, and the Heisei era of Godzilla movies is the thing that ushers in a whole new wave of giant monster stuff. So you've got those sort of 7 total Heisei era Godzilla movies. Those run to 1995 with Godzilla vs. Destroya, which kind of ends that little run, and then Godzilla goes away for a little bit until you make Godzilla 2000. And the success and popularity of those Godzilla movies are what brings about this whole big wave that goes until about 2004 with Godzilla Final Wars, at which point then you go on hiatus again until Shin Godzilla brings the giant monster boom back. But amidst this resurgence with Godzilla, you then, of course, have your other kaiju franchises coming back as well. So in 1996, Ultraman returns with Ultraman Tiga, a very, very good show that I'm almost done watching. And then, of course, we have Gamera coming back as well. So Daiei Films, which is now, of course, still owned by Tokuma Shoten, they began production on a rebooted Gamera film inspired by the success of these new Godzilla vs. movies, and they hired the director Kaneko Shusuke and the writer Ito Kazunori and special effects director Higuchi Shinji as the lead creatives. Just as a note, I've kept their names in Japanese name order just because I did a lot of my reading in Japanese to put my notes together, and it just, for my sanity, it's just a lot easier to keep the names in the Japanese order when I'm putting that together. So they decided to take this opportunity and bring Gamera back to completely reboot the Gamera franchise and make it anew totally from the ground up, change the tone of the movies by having them being much more grounded, having a much darker tone than the old Gamera films did, but still obviously trying to retain certain key elements of Gamera being a heroic monster and Gamera having a strong connection to children. So they kept that while making everything else sort of pretty radically different than the old Gamera movies. So then we have your first of these movies come out, Gamera Guardian of the Universe, as it's called in English, or Gamera Daikaiju Kuju Kessen. which is a title that references the Japanese title for the Gamera movie, Gamera versus Gyaos. So Gyaos as a monster comes from one of the early Gamera movies, and they brought Gyaos back as a monster for their rebooted Gamera film. This movie releases in 1995. And it only has a moderate success at the box office. Dai/Tokuma were aiming for at least 1 billion yen gross at the box office, but the movie fell pretty dramatically short of that with only 500 million yen. Though there was also 2 months before the release of this movie, there was the Hanshin earthquake happened. And so there's like a lot of people talk about that. That probably had a pretty negative effect on the overall box office for this first movie. Just for a reference, when you're thinking of like how much these kinds of movies made, the Heisei Godzilla movies coming out around this time consistently grossed somewhere between 1.5 to 2 billion yen per movie. So that 1 billion yen was probably not a terrible goal to set, but unfortunately the Gamera movies, none of the 3 Gamera movies ever quite hit that goal. However, the movies were a big critical success, and they became very popular in their home release version and then on TV broadcast. So like these Gamera movies have a bigger life outside of the theater really than they had inside of the theater. And the movie did have pretty notable critical acclaim when it came out, particularly for its genre. The most notable thing is that it received, it was ranked number 6 on the top 10 movies in the Kinema Junpo list for 1995, which is the first time any kaiju film had ever been placed in that top 10. And that would not happen again until 2016 with Shin Godzilla, which was number 2. And then also last year, 2023, Godzilla Minus One was placed at number 8 of the top 10 movies that year in that publication.
Yeah, and that's a big deal in Japan. For those who don't know, Kinema Junpo is kind of like their Kaiju Cinema. It's their biggest film magazine in the country, and they have done this top 10 poll for decades, so it's always a notable thing.
Yeah, the top 10 poll predates the kaiju genre. So it's like when we say it's the first one in there, like, that is like even the original Godzilla movie was not rated there. So it's pretty cool. Also, Kaneko, the director, did win Best Director for the movie at the Japanese Blue Ribbon Awards as well. But then I have a couple of other pretty fun little facts here that I just find amusing. So there's a very Mario and Sonic at the Olympics-esque thing happening here, where when you put the movie in for Gamera, if you're someone who knows Gamera and you're like expecting to see the Dai logo immediately, instead the Toho logo comes up, and it's always a weird moment like seeing Sonic in a Nintendo game. The reason why the Toho logo is on this movie is that Tokuma Shoten is not a film distribution company. Tokuma Shoten, that bought Dai the rest of Gamera, is a book publication company, and so they do not own or like kind of operate the same distribution network as Dai used to. And so the movies are actually all distributed by Toho, which are, of course, the makers of Godzilla. So there's always a weird kind of like rival thing that's happening when you have those logos pop up at the beginning of the movie. A couple of other fun facts I have here that I discovered early in director Kaneko's career. He did one of the first things Kaneko ever did, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in his director notes. He wrote the script for episode 2 of the original anime adaptation of Urusei Yatsura. This is notable because there is a scene near the end of that episode where one of the characters in Urusei Yatsura, Tsubame, who's a little swallow, like a little bird, turns into a giant kaiju monster and builds a nest on Tokyo Tower. And it is very similar to what happens with Gyaos at the end of the first Gamera movie.
That's amazing.
Yes. And then another fun note here is that Kaneko, the director, he was in the running potentially to be the director for the 1992 Godzilla movie Godzilla vs. Mothra, and he did not ultimately direct that movie. Again, I'll talk about that a little bit later in kind of the background for him as a director. But notably, some of the kind of ideas he started prototyping for that movie around Godzilla fighting Mothra, which Godzilla being an earthbound creature and then Mothra being this big flying thing. Some of those ideas for some of the action scenes in that planned movie, were then kind of transplanted here into Gamera fighting Gyaos. So just a couple of little like fun things I found about the production of that first one. While production was underway on Gamera 1, they already greenlit the sequel because they were very kind of happy with the way that the production of that first movie was going. So before Gamera 1 even came out in the movie theater, they were already making Gamera 2, Attack of Legion. And that's why the sequel comes out so quickly, right? So the sequel comes out the next year in 1996. Notably for the sequel, the production team abandoned the idea of using an old Gamera villain because a lot of the old Gamera movies do not have the best monsters. Probably the best one is, I forget his name, but there's the one that has like the giant knife head, which is a very goofy looking monster that people might recognize. But Gamera's other monsters are not great, so they decided to just come up with their own monster, which is where they created Legion. This movie did do better than the first, but it still did not make its billion yen mark. It made 700 million yen in the movie theater, which is still like a very good, respectable gross for this kind of movie, but not what Dai really wants from these films. So that means that it took a little bit for the production of the third movie to kick off. So that's why the third movie, there's a bigger gap. So they make their last of these Gamera movies, 1999's Gamera 3 Revenge of Iris, or Iris's Awakening, or The Awakening of the Evil God, depending on how you want to translate the Japanese title. And this ended up being the final film, though Kaneko did later reveal in an interview that there were plans potentially to continue with a fourth or even potentially a fifth Gamera film if this movie had surpassed that 1 billion yen goal at the box office, but it fell short, this one splitting the difference between the previous two movies, this one getting 600 million yen at the box office. So they kind of set it up to be like, if this is the last movie, it's still a satisfying ending. And they obviously brought back characters from the first movie and stuff to give it a nice kind of holistic feel. But it was not a like, we are sure going to make this the last movie. There were plans to potentially do another one if this really kicked off. One really strange note on the making of Gamera 3 is that there is a 2-hour making of documentary for this movie that is directed by a very obscure little director named Ano Hideaki. People might know him if you've seen the live action adaptation of Cutie Honey. He made that film. But yeah, he did a whole 2-hour making of documentary called Gamera 1999. And I have not watched the whole thing because I did not have time to, but it's very weird. It's a very like frank thing, and it's all shot on a cheap digital camera from the late 90s, and it's like it is not what you think of when you think of a behind the scenes documentary. It's very much about like being integrated into the production and just kind of showing and like conversations of like Kaneko and other members of the crew discussing and debating what they want to do for the film. It's very strange. It is also luckily very easily accessible with English subtitles. If you go on the Internet Archive, you can find it. It is, yeah. And if people didn't catch my joke, this is, of course, Ano Hideaki, or Hideaki Anno, is also the guy who made Neon Genesis Evangelion. So that's why.
And Shin Godzilla, and Shin Ultraman, and Shin Kamen Rider. He turns out, you know what? He likes kaiju movies.
Yes, you know? He likes kaiju movies a lot. And it's very funny. If you know his directorial style, you watch the documentary, you don't need to be told that Ano directed it. Because, like, one of the first things that happens is, like, giant white text on the screen with, like, sudden cuts to it. We're like, oh yeah, no, yep, this is the Eva guy.
Yes, it's amazing. I watched a little bit of it. I wish I had had more time to watch it, Sean, but it's I just love that. I mean, it actually makes sense that he was into this at the time, because so Higuchi would have been like kicking off his career with these at this time, while Ano is doing Neon Genesis Evangelion, and then they come together, you know, much later for all the Shin movies, and it's a cool kind of confluence of events.
Yeah, so it's just very funny that it's funny and weird and cool this documentary exists. Yeah. So then just like a little like what happens to them later. So in 2002, not long after the finishing of these Gamera movies, Tokuma Shoten would eventually then sell Dai and its various properties to Kadokawa. So Kadokawa still owns Gamera and all the other Dai stuff. Kadokawa had made one Gamera movie called Gamera the Brave in 2006, which is not very good. And then Gamera went dormant until 2023, just last year, where Kadokawa made a 3D animated series called Gamera Rebirth, done, I think, mostly by the same people that did the 3 animated Godzilla movies. I've not had time to watch Gamera Rebirth yet. It did not get reviewed very well, so I'm not kind of eager to watch it, and the trailers didn't look very good. And both Gamera the Brave and Gamera Rebirth have not done very well. I mean, I don't know how you gauge how well something does when it's on Netflix, but you know, nobody talks about Gamera Rebirth. Even in like the Kaiju fan community, that series was just like broadly ignored. So who knows what the fate of Gamera is in the future, but at least we have these 3 incredible Heisei era movies that they made.
You know, I think the fate of Gamera is he is walking off to fight all the Gauss with one of his fucking arms missing and a giant hole in his stomach. That to me is Gamera's fate, and it's kind of both dark and inspiring.
It is very inspiring. All right, before we get into the movies, I do want to run down some of our major people here in the production we've kind of been talking around a little bit, because I think the key thing that makes these movies so good is they have, particularly for like the top 3 guys, our director, special effects director, and screenplay writer, it's an absolute dream team. And so let's run down who these guys are. So our main director, our director here is Kaneko Shusuke, or Shusuke Kaneko. He this was the first giant monster movies he made. So Gamera 1 was his first kaiju film that he directed, though not for lack of trying. He grew up as a fan of kaiju movies, and he always wanted to direct one. One like fun little anecdote around that is he made a like sort of fan-made manga when he was a little kid. After he saw King Kong versus Godzilla at the movie theater, and he changed the ending in his fan-made manga to having Godzilla win rather than King Kong at the end of that because he was not satisfied with the outcome of that movie's fight. And so,
that is called patriotism. That is Japanese pride. No, exactly. The American monkey does not win. Godzilla is king of the monsters. Yeah. God damn it.
I mean, because to be fair, they had to really tweak a lot of the kind of setting around King Kong to have him even be able to fight Godzilla, because King Kong's supposed to be like 3 stories tall, not like 50 stories tall. So it's like, I understand being unsatisfied with, it's King Kong versus Godzilla. It's a great movie. But the ending is maybe slightly questionable how that fight rolls out. So, he's got a lot of proper bona fides in terms of his kind of kaiju fandom and his, desire to want to be a director for one of these movies. He was considered for various projects while kind of coming up as a director through the 80s. So Daiei / Tokuma Shoten tried to make these, or they did make these Daimajin movies that are not very good, about like a giant monster statue kind of thing. And he was considered potentially for those movies and didn't get them. As I talked about earlier, he was considered for the Godzilla vs. Mothra movie, and that one, from what I can tell, he was fairly close, but ultimately did not get that project. And then there was also an aborted attempt to adapt Ultra Q to film, that then later a different Ultra Q movie came out, but there was an earlier one that they wanted to bring back, Ultra Q being the sort of predecessor of the Ultraman franchise, and they kind of said like, oh, let's like bring that back and do a movie version of it. And he got kind of far along on like that actually being a thing, including getting the screenwriter signed on, Ito Kazunori, who he then is the screenwriter for these Gamera movies. But ultimately that Ultra Q movie was not made, and they made a different one later. So then, he tries to get a bunch of these movies, doesn't quite get it until finally he is selected to be the director of these Gamera films. After the Gamera movies, he would go on to direct the incredible 2001 Godzilla movie, Godzilla, Mothra, King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All Out Attack, or GMK, as it's more commonly known, because that's a hell of a mouthful of a title. And he did make several episodes of the Ultraman series, Ultraman Max, which came out in 2005. But those are the last giant monster movies that he made. Other notable movies people might know him from is if you've seen the live-action adaptations of Death Note, or the original ones, the movies from Japan in the mid-2000s, he directed those.
Which I love. I think those are great movies, and I think he did a really outstanding job. They obviously don't have like the budget or the effects prowess of these. Like, honestly, I look at these movies and I'm like, why didn't they do Ryuk as like a costume or something? Because the CGI in those is terrible. But I think in terms of the human drama and his style of shooting, it's very distinctive. And I think those Death Note movies, they're a cut above any other like live action anime movies I've seen in terms of like taking the material, like feeling like you're not just doing a cosplay event. They're real movies. They're not perfect, but in some ways they're improvements on the manga in some places. They're really good. Yeah,
and Kaneko, I think his like style as a director is so good at being able to ground human drama amongst like really kind of like strange, high-minded, weird shit going on, whether that's giant monsters or the kind of absurdities of Death Note as a franchise, with, fucking Grim Reapers and the Death Note and all that stuff happening. And he's just so good at capturing the human perspective and being able to flesh out those characters. And so while the Death Note movies are obviously a different beast than kaiju movies, I think that skill set kind of translates between the two genres, or like these two kind of franchises he did.
He's also, there were 2 other things I noticed. One is that he likes doing little media satire. There's a lot of that in the second Gamera, and the second Death Note movie is a lot of big, like, media satire stuff. And then also, he's great at location shooting. Like, the Gamera movies have so much, like, Thomas and I were both, my brother, he watched the first one with me, and then I watched the other 2, obviously. But we were both noticing places we'd been in Japan, that he just, like, takes the camera to places. Like, in the third movie, Iris, when he lands in Kyoto, is landing at a place that, like, we were in walking distance from our hotel we stayed in Kyoto, and was on that temple that he lands near. We visited that, and it was just like, there's all these locations, and the Death Note movies do this too. Death Note 1, the big subway sequence, had a big scene where they, like, shut down the Tokyo subway, which I think was the first time a movie had gotten a license to do that. And he's just very good at, like, grounding stuff in places and locations and not just staying on a soundstage. And I was very impressed with that throughout all of this.
Yeah, so yeah, I think he's just like a very, very skilled director, particularly at these kinds of things for those reasons, like being able to ground stuff. But like one thing that's very, very cool is that he has a pretty close relationship to Mamoru Oshii or Oshii Mamoru, who people would know as obviously like he's a big anime guy, so you'd know him as the director of like the Ghost in the Shell movies and stuff like that, or one of Oshii Mamoru's first big jobs is he was the director of Urusei Yatsura. So Kaneko's first job really in the entertainment industry was writing that script for Urusei Yatsura Episode 2. He got that job because Oshii Mamoru was his senpai at college at their film studies club. And so that's like kind of, and then there's other things when we get to the screenwriter that there's a close relationship and kind of creative relationship there, which I think is very cool.
That sounds like something you should like make an anime about like Oshii Mamoru and Shusuke Kaneko like being in film club together and then working on Urusei Yatsura. I don't know. That sounds like a Bakuman style to the authors of Death Note, like style manga about manga or something, or film. Yeah, that's great. I also love always remembering that Mamoru Oshii, director of Ghost in the Shell, got his start on Urusei Yatsura. Because that's what you think of when you think of
yes.
Mamoru Oshii, is Urusei Yatsura. It's great.
Yeah. So that's my notes on Kaneko here. Now let's talk a little bit about our special effects director, which we've been talking around, Higuchi Shinji, or Shinji Higuchi in the English name order. So Higuchi, he began work as a special effects assistant in movies in the 80s. He does actually have a very like low level credit, but a credit on Godzilla 1984 or Return of Godzilla. As a modeling assistant is what he's credited on. So imagine that's like probably fairly low hanging, special effects kind of credit of helping make some of the models and stuff. In 1985, Higuchi would get his first work as a special effects director on a fan-made project, a fan-made kaiju parody film called Yamato no Orochi no Gyakushu, or the counterattack of Yamato no Orochi. Yamato no Orochi being the eight-headed serpent from Japanese mythology. This was like a comedy parody film, a kaiju film, and it was produced by an otaku fan group called Daikon Films. Shortly afterwards, Daikon Films would change its name to Gainax Studios, which people probably know that name a little bit better, and Gainax would begin producing their anime projects, and through working on those projects, Higuchi met and befriended our man, director Ano Hideaki, director of great works like the live-action adaptation of Cutie Honey, and the rest is history. Ano is actually, he is in the Yamato no Orochi film as an actor, like he's like a cameo kind of guy in that movie. So Higuchi and Ano have a long working relationship from that point on throughout all the 80s and the 90s. Higuchi works on basically everything Ano does. He is a storyboard artist and episode director on most of Gainax's productions, including things like Nadia's Secret of the Blue Water and, of course, Neon Genesis Evangelion. Higuchi's special effects work on the Gamera Trilogy is among the best in the history of the genre. In my opinion, and I think basically everyone's opinion, was vital for providing the radical, grounded perspective that Kaneko and Higuchi wanted for the film. So a lot of Higuchi's work was used to kind of try to achieve these interesting, complex shots that try to sell the scale of the monsters by showing them from the perspective of people on the ground or in buildings through windows and stuff like that. Not to say that no giant monster movies before this ever had shots like that, but it's like the frequency and like variety of those kinds of shots and sequences are so dominant in these movies, and this is like how every kaiju movie is shot from this point on, or at least tries to be shot from this point on. Like all the Millennium Era Godzilla movies, starting with Godzilla 2000, you can see the influence of the way that these Gamera movies were shot so clearly. The Legendary movies, very clearly, either directly or indirectly. Like, I don't know if the directors of those movies saw these Gamera movies or not, but they saw movies that these Gamera movies inspired, or they saw these Gamera movies, right? And so the way that
I think they saw these Gamera movies. I think, like, narratively, like, it's too, like, I know Godzilla also has like his heroism in different Japanese movies, although in the Millennium Era they would be pulling from not as much. He's a villain in a lot of those. Mm-hmm. So like I think the way they characterize Godzilla in like 2014 especially, which is very Spielbergian, these movies are very Spielbergian, particularly the third one. And like I think there's something about their presentation of Gamera as not necessarily fully benevolent, but not at all malevolent in his like protection. Like that is how they characterize Godzilla in particularly those first couple of Legendary movies. I think they saw these.
Yes. And I think the thing that's really impressive is that a lot of those more modern kaiju movies, obviously like Shin Godzilla being one of the other ones, they're using CG effects, which make it a lot easier to get these kinds of shots. Like,
Yeah.
if you look at some of the behind the scenes stuff, like, I don't have enough technical knowledge to be able to describe what they're doing, but you can see the complexity of trying to build these miniature sets and use camera angles and how, like, open and big those sets have to be in order to try to get these shots of Gamera stomping around and looking at him from, like, below, and what they're able to do and how just fucking good that looks. And also, it's just the quality of the suits are so good. The animatronic head on the Gamera suit is incredible and so expressive. Like, just top to bottom, Higuchi and the special effects team that he led, they just did such incredible work on these movies. So clearly so, because Higuchi was given the special effects award for his work on this movie in the 1996 Japanese Academy Awards. So it's like these movies were acclaimed at the time for this in that critical space as well. He has also worked as a storyboard artist and special effects person on many, many other live action productions throughout the 90s and 2000s. He's done lots and lots of work on various Ultraman shows and things like that. And of course, I feel like people nowadays are going to really know Higuchi as the director / special effects director on Shin Godzilla and Shin Ultraman, which, if you want to see like where a lot of this style had like kind of evolved, you can watch those movies and there's a clear route. Obviously there's like a lot of differences because you don't have Kaneko's style there for Shin Godzilla or Shin Ultraman, but the way that I think you think of the special effects and integrating those, like there's just such a clear through line between Higuchi's work on these movies and what he does in Shin Godzilla and Shin Ultraman. It's very cool. You can see his style shining through in these different films.
Yes, and like I think the whole approach he has to the personality of the monsters, and that they're a little Lovecraftian. They're like a little like weird, like Gamera is not warm and fuzzy. He's heroic, but he's not cute. Like there's something about that that's very Higuchi, I think. And you can see in his later work.
And especially the Gyaos, I think, have like a lot of that Shin Godzilla, like there's an emptiness behind the eyes that is very unsettling and has that Lovecraftian quality that for sure. It's very cool. But we also have a couple of other people that are really awesome that worked on these movies that are very defining for them. So we have our screenplay writer, Ito Kazunori, who he's got a fucking crazy career. So Ito is particularly famous as an anime writer, though he's done plenty of live action movies as well. And he's most known as being through his partnership with director Oshii Mamoru, and that is also the connection through which he is on these movies because, right, you have Kaneko's relationship with Mamoru. Through that, you then have Ito Kazunori, and then they get kind of hooked up, and they're worked on multiple projects before this, including potentially on that Ultra Q movie. But then now they actually get these Gamera movies together. Ito Kazunori has just a ridiculously prolific career as a screenwriter, particularly in the world of anime. Some of his main credits that really stand out, he was the series writer on Urusei Yatsura, which obviously I assume that if they had not met before, that is where Kaneko and Ito would have met because Kaneko wrote one of the episodes for Urusei Yatsura. He was also the series writer on Magical Angel Creamy Mami, which is one of like the sort of foundational Maho Shoujo or magical girl shows in the 80s. He's the series
just so everyone
writer.
knows, it's Creamy Mommy as in M-A-M-I, not Creamy Mommy as in the porn category or whatever, you know.
Yeah. It is a hard show title to say in English because it sounds like you're saying something very different. It is not. It is a totally normal little girl magical girl TV show. There's nothing weird about it. He was also the series writer on Maison Ikkoku, which is one of the other Rumiko Takahashi manga adaptations like Urusei Yatsura, Maison Ikkoku being one of my personal favorite anime ever. He was the main writer for basically all the Pat Labor stuff, whether you're looking at Pat Labor on TV, the OVAs, or the movies. I think you can see a lot of the same, like, economy of screenplay writing on those movies as in the Gamera films. He is also the writer of the original Ghost in the Shell movie, and he is the writer for the Dot Hack series, the kind of like OG in some ways, like weird video game isekai franchise. He is also a noted fan of a lot of different kaiju movies, and he often works references to kaiju movies into the various things that he works on, and obviously a lot of things like Pat Labor's sort of kaiju adjacent, being giant monster stuff. But if you just look at that, particularly the movies, if you look at the Pat Labor movies, you look at the first Ghost in the Shell, like, I did not know before I did the research that the Ghost in the Shell dude wrote these Gamera films, and I was like, oh, well, that makes sense. Like, there is a, like, high concept and economy to being able to deliver that high concept at work in these Gamera films, that as impressive as everything else is, the screenplays are just as impressive and just as vital to making these movies as good as they are, because, man, it is hard to do a good screenplay for a giant monster movie. Just watch a lot of giant monster movies and you can tell that is like probably the hardest thing to do for these, is how do you do the story? How do you integrate the plot and the characters with the giant monster shit? Like, that is the hurdle that the vast majority of these movies kind of fall at and end up being mediocre kaiju films. And the thing that separates a great kaiju film from a mediocre one is the screenplay. It is how well are you doing at integrating all those different elements to deliver a big holistic story. And that difficulty is multiplied basically when you're not just doing one giant monster, but doing a movie that has at least two giant monsters and they have to fight each other. And it is so rare, or almost never, do you see a screenplay as good at doing that as these three. Like, there's only a tiny handful of the very best Godzilla versus movies are anywhere near this level. And so it makes a lot of sense you have someone who is so experienced and has so much sort of like practical history in doing this kind of high concept screenplay writing work, that Ito Kazunori is clearly like a hugely vital part of what makes these movies so good.
Another way I was thinking of saying that, Sean, is that like the magic trick of the great kaiju movies is when the human parts don't feel like filler to make it so that you don't have to have the whole movie be giant monster stuff, because you can never have a whole movie be giant monster stuff. That's too much work, too much money, all that stuff, right? And so bad monster movies are the ones where you get to the parts with the humans and you zone out because you can tell they were kind of zoning out. And good ones is when you're engaged all the way through. Like, this was the magic trick of Godzilla -1 last year, was that like, oh my god, the human content is like so dynamic. And I wouldn't say like these movies, they're not trying to do anything that deep with the characterization, but they are tight and on point, start to finish, all three of these. And I think knowing that he was the writer for the Pat Labor movies and Ghost in the Shell, as you just said in particular, like, absolutely the DNA is clear. These are not as politically like explicit as those movies are, but they have the same feeling of being very integrated in terms of like, what are the scientists, the government, the journalists, like all the pieces of society that are kind of moving together around the Gamera issue. They're very smart. I also think like the script is another thing that feels like it was influential on Shin Godzilla, because like these have little bits of kind of satire in there that Shin Godzilla would really take and run with. But I think the way they kind of do this like broad ensemble storytelling with all of this is part of what makes it work so well. And yeah, great scripts. He's a great writer. Someone at some point needs to do some kind of investigation into why all the people writing the Rumiko Takahashi adaptations then went on to do all these like dark, heavy mecha and giant monster things, because I think that is a fascinating crossover. But yeah, it's great.
Yeah, absolutely. And then our last person I wanted to shout out is our musical composer here, who is Otani Ko, because I love the soundtracks for these three movies. And Otani, he has a long-standing partnership with Kaneko, the director. He's done a lot of his other movies, including he's the composer for GMK, or Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All Out Attack. And Otani has had a very broad career as a composer. He's done lots of live action. He's done lots of live action TV. He's done a lot of anime. He's done a fair number of video games. Some of his credits that I looked at that really jumped out to me that I thought was kind of cool. He's the composer for the City Hunter 2 and 3 anime, which I haven't gotten to those ones yet, but City Hunter has such good music that I just assume it's really good there too. But one thing that we both watched that has a really good soundtrack, that's maybe one of the best things in the show, is he's the guy who composed the soundtrack for Mobile Suit Gundam Wing, which that's a wild fucking... I did not expect that. And that would have been at the same time, too.
Same time, yeah.
Which is very funny. But yeah, that's, Gundam Wing, a very flawed TV show, but the music is fantastic.
Beyond reproach, great music.
Yes. And then maybe one of his most acclaimed soundtracks he's done is he did the soundtrack for the video game Shadow of the Colossus, which he's not done a lot of video games, and maybe that is one of the things that they probably intentionally went for a non-video game composer, Shadow of the Colossus, but that is a very acclaimed soundtrack that I believe was award-winning at the time. And yeah, so that was like a very cool and like unexpected thing to find. Like, I feel like usually you don't look at someone's credits and see from so many different sectors of media, so many really great kind of like soundtracks. I feel like usually composers tend to lean, I'm mainly the TV guy, I'm mainly a video game guy, I'm mainly a movie guy, and he's very kind of broad in kind of what he's worked on. But yeah, the soundtracks for the Gamera movies are fantastic. I love the main theme for Gamera in particular, which has like so much like, there's like a terror and a dread to it, but there's like a majesty to it and a kind of heroism underneath it. But like all those kind of complicated things that Gamera represents, both being this like scary giant monster, but also this hero that protects us. It's all contained in that big, great sort of central theme that is in all three of the films. And I also love like how the music evolves in the three movies, and the Iris movie in particular has some very different feel to it in some of the music. But I feel like it's a thing that outside of some of your like mainstays, like obviously Ifukube on the Godzilla franchise, a lot of times the music in giant monster movies that aren't Ifukube Godzilla scores just kind of like fall into the background and are very kind of unremarkable. And I think that the soundtracks for these Gamera movies really stand out in that almost like they're not quite John Williams-esque, but there is a that kind of Spielbergian quality you're talking about that these movies have. Part of it is I think the soundtracks are that kind of great Hollywood theme-based, leitmotif-based soundtracks.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the music for a minute because I think it's one of the like secret to these movies' success. And I do think the pithy way to describe it to someone who maybe hasn't seen it is that it does sound like if John Williams did a kaiju movie. It has that, it's very thematic, it's very big and orchestral. It's a little different than Ifukube in that sense, who has, his music is a little like kind of darker and heavier. But like, it's phenomenal. It's got this kind of, pulpy punch. I wrote last night in my little letterboxd review of this movie that it makes these films sort of feel like a window into an alternate universe where superhero movies didn't all sound like fucking garbage. Like, this is what Marvel movies should sound like. Like, the soundtrack to these movies, it's like, it's not breaking any new ground necessarily, but like there is I don't know how to say it, but there's like a kind of like a pop myth making to the score that is so good and is so like nuts and bolts excellent and like sweeps it all along, because these movies have so many locations and characters and ideas on their mind, and you need music to like, I think, tie the world of the movie together. And I think these scores do it. I was like noticing the music in every scene in these three movies and going like, holy shit, this is so good. Like, these are definitely the best kaiju movie scores I've heard other than Ifukube and maybe like what Naoki Sato did on Godzilla -1, but like that's a very different kind of movie to begin with. But I think for like these kind of movies, this is another one where I'm like, I want Hollywood to look at this. I want Hollywood to watch these movies and go, your superhero movies could sound like this. They really could. They don't have to sound like an AI wrote the music. Like, it can be human and beautiful and big. And I think like the third movie in particular, down the home stretch, like, oh my God, it's like really selling the weight, because that third movie, we'll get to it, takes a fucking swing with its like themes and content and tone, and I don't think that swing would land if it weren't for the music being able to go along with it. So Ko Otani, like, one of the MVPs of these. I mean, they're all MVPs, obviously. If you didn't have these people in these positions on all three of these movies, they wouldn't be the movies they are. But wow, I think it's easy to overlook music in our conversations, particularly because you and I are not music experts. But these are fantastic scores.
Yeah, and I just think it's like the thing, the secret sauce for these movies is they got so many great people who had done so much great work beforehand, and getting them all together and getting them on all three of these movies, it just creates that consistency in tone and style. Because again, oftentimes you'd get like, maybe for this and Gamera 2, because they're made at the same time, you'd have the same production crew. But then maybe on the third one, we have a different director, but you would maybe keep the special effects guy, right? That's like a lot of how these movies were typically made, particularly once you got to the 90s. And it's so central to having all these people. They're all so good. A lot of them have like a pre-existing relationship and working history together, and having them all here together for all three films, it is the thing that makes these movies the ones that you can recommend to anybody. Whether you like giant monster movies or not, you can enjoy these movies because there's such a clarity of like purpose, theme, storytelling, spectacle, and all three of them have it together. It's just one of the most consistent, high-quality trilogies of movies, I think, that really exist.
Yeah, I completely agree. Just fantastic stuff. And I guess that means we can get into talking about the main content of these movies, right, Sean?
Yeah, hell yeah. So let's get into Gamera. Let's talk about Gamera #1, Gamera Guardian of the Universe.
Yeah, I think overall this is like the most perfect of the three. This is the one that like feels the most like solid unto itself. I think the second one was probably my least favorite, slightly more uneven, although still great. And then the third one I think is a little uneven, but also more ambitious than the other two, so it kind of blew me away even more.
Yeah.
But I think, this one is as easy a movie to recommend to people as I think a movie can be. It is both extraordinarily fun, and I think just the way a kaiju versus movie, a kaiju origin story movie can be fun. But then it also, like, it has, of course, the incredible effects. I think it has some rich characterization. I think it has some light thematization in terms of, like, the way the environment plays back. This is kind of like Gamera is like a manifestation of the planet. It's kind of like a lot of this was in the 90s in Japan, like with Final Fantasy VII or something, where these forces of the world like kind of fighting back. Also, I think very influential on the legendary monster movies, as we've said. And I just enjoyed the hell out of it. And again, I didn't have any experience with Gamera. I knew he was a crazy turtle. My biggest experience with Gamera is that Akira Toriyama loved to make Gamera jokes in Dragon Ball.
Yes.
There was Baby Gamera who Kame Sennin would fly on sometimes, and it was just like, it was clearly because Toriyama found Gamera funny, and Toriyama was writing that before these movies when Gamera was more of kind of a kitsch kids character. And so that's what I knew him from. But like Sean, I was amazed at how by the second half of this movie, I was so emotionally invested in Gamera that like when the military is like firing on him, like, no, Gamera, so you can win, you can do it. And when he's fighting the Gauss at the end, I'm like, go Gamera. I feel like I'm one of the like little kids in the audience, like falling in love with the giant turtle monster who doesn't actually care for me because he is a manifestation of nature. It's amazing.
Yeah, I think that's the thing about these movies, and this movie in particular, because I agree with the assessment you just, kind of the breakdown you did of the trilogy is absolutely how I feel about these. This first movie is like perfect. Like, I think of like, they're obviously very different movies in a lot of ways, but I think of this movie, I put in the same box as like Terminator 1. Like, it's just, there's everything this movie sets out to do, it does perfectly. There's not a single minute of wasted time. It is just the most perfect execution of its sort of implicit goals. And then movie 2 is very good, but it doesn't, you just can't follow up this first one and kind of match it if you're doing a lot more of the same. Though I think some of what the movie 2 does with the monster I really love. And then movie 3, I don't maybe like as much as movie 1, but it goes for something so different and it takes such a big swing. It has such a memorable climax. But this first one, it is so tight and so perfect. And I think some of the stuff I talked about earlier in the conversation of one of the things I love about these movies is they're able to do things that Godzilla movies can't do. It's exactly what you just said. Like, Gamera gets to be transparently a heroic monster. And the third movie will kind of like challenge that or question that a little bit. But this first movie, I think, really wants you immediately to be on Gamera's side. You're like, you're rooting for him like he is a superhero character. And I love the way that a lot of the little like sort of oddities around Gamera get used in that way. Like his ability to fly in this, like it comes across like fucking Superman, like he swoops in out of nowhere, comes down, lands, and goes and takes care of business. And there's a superheroism to him, and the way that also that the world doesn't understand Gamera, but we do, which is like maybe like Superman doesn't have that so much, but lots of superhero characters have that quality, like a Batman or Spider-Man, where it's like, oh, the police don't like him because he's the masked vigilante and all this stuff, and it's like, oh, the newspapers and J. Jonah Jameson hate him, but we love him, right? It's like you, the audience, the kids, like we get that he is the hero and he's fighting to save us, and we understand that that's true even if the world doesn't understand it. And that's the thing that both makes him very superheroic. It's also the thing I'll want to like hit on later, particularly the second and the third movie, of the kind of like Christ-like elements of Gamera that are very prominent in these movies that I love, that he's a messianic like figure in a way that's very fun and cool. Because, that thing I just said about like we get he's the good guy, but the world hates him. That's like kind of how I think sort of Jesus is pitched a little bit in kind of Christian sort of like mythos. But that element, it's so cool that these movies preserve it while making the movies notably way darker than the old Gamera movies were. And they can be like quite violent and very sort of like scary. Like there's a horror quality to these movies. And it's in here with like the Gauss, and some of the stuff early on with the Gauss. That's very kind of like creepy and a bit unsettling. And you get to have all of that stuff and those darker elements while not sacrificing the fun, like little kid part of you that wants you to jump up and root and cheer for Gamera when he comes in, and defeats the big monster. And that's just a thing that Godzilla can do to a certain extent, but you can't take it as far as these movies take it. Because another thing they're able to do with Gamera is that Gamera gets hurt. He gets fucked up in all of these movies. Like Gamera gets pushed on the back foot and has to sort of like push back from being the kind of underdog in the fights at a certain point, and that is established in this first film. And all of those things give you this childlike wonder and adoration for Gamera that makes you really want to root for him. That is so fun and so infectious. And as you say, by the time you're in the second half of this movie, you're just like, what the fuck are you doing, Japan? Like, back up Gamera. Why are you shooting him with missiles? Like, he's here for us. Why don't you get it? And you have the little girl, Akagi. I guess she's not a little girl, like the teen girl. Who she's the one with the psychic connection to Gamera, and she's the only one who gets it, and all the other adults have to fucking get in line and figure out that like the kids are the future and Gamera's here for the kids. That element of this film is so fun, and I just think it's a real magic trick that it's able to kind of have its cake and eat it too. It's able to be a darker, more grounded, more mature, more violent, scarier version of one of these movies, while also getting to have the cool little kid stuff in it.
Yeah, it's like a real platonic ideal of all those things. It's also like, it is using a familiar shape in a lot of ways. It is an origin story. It's both a superhero origin and a kaiju origin. And we know what both of those look like, right? We know the kaiju origin is like, oh, there's weird stuff going on in the ocean. There's a ship that like landed on something weird, or like there was radiation, and then you've got to figure out what that is, and there's some mystical lore. And it's the same with the superhero movie origin of like, this mysterious power is arising, but there's also this villain over here. And it does both of those so well that it never feels overly familiar. And it's not like I can necessarily point to any one idea that it's doing that is like brand new that no one had ever thought of. I just think it is such, and I think this is down to Kazunori Ito's screenplay, is like, it is such a solid, tight, quick, this is a 95-minute movie, this is tight, and it is such a good execution of those things that like, when, you know, the ship is landing on like the mysterious atoll that like is coming out of the ocean, like, oh, what is it? But of course we know that, oh, that must be Gamera, and that's cool. And you know, you're learning about the Gauss and all those steps along the process. There's like a real joy to them. And of course, then there's also just the effects are so good that when you get to those moments that any superhero movie or kaiju movie has to get to, where you have to pay off the mystery and the like the build up, it is the best payoff to all of that like you will ever see.
Yeah.
And so this sucker moves. It is entertaining. It's just all of those pieces are in place, and it is. I was kind of joking about this, but I was thinking about it. I think you could take the screenplay for this movie, or particularly the second movie. I think the second movie even more so, and just do a pretty quick find and replace with Turtle to Kryptonian, and it would be a pretty good Superman screenplay.
Yes.
Like both of these. Like, maybe not perfectly ideal, because Superman is not that distant from humanity, but like, it could work. You could totally make it work with fairly minor changes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, especially the second movie, which is an alien invasion story.
Yes.
It's a little bit more Superman-esque for sure, and it's so engaging to kind of go along for that ride. And I think one thing that's just so impressive, it is the economy of it. Like, you have Gamera shit and Gauss shit going down within the first 10 minutes of this movie. We've got people, you know, washing up on this weird atoll in the middle of the ocean that seems to be moving. We've got people getting attacked by giant monster birds. You've got one of my favorite moments early on. This is the most Steven Spielberg moment in any of these movies to me, is where they've got the giant pile of bird dung in the village early, before they don't really know what the Gauss are. And you've got our main character, the scientist lady, who's like checking it out with our haphazard police detective, who's the guy in all three of the movies that I love. They bring him back over and over. But she's like searching through the dung, and there's her like mentor scientist pair of glasses are in there because it couldn't get digested. And it like slops down, and you have this little shot of like this gooey shit just sliding over the glasses, and then it cuts that over to the Gamera side of the story. But the way that it sort of plays with that mystery and gets into it immediately. There's none of this shit of like the Godzilla 2014, where it commits the whole first half of the movie to Bryan Cranston and Sun and all that shit in the reactor and all of that, and like slowly building up the appearance of this monster, only then kill off the Bryan Cranston's character and have someone else replace it. Like, you know, there's some of that stuff can be fun, but there's a tendency in a lot of more modern Hollywood movies that I think is the thing we're talking about, where you say like, I wish these movies would watch this and like kind of like mimic or learn from what it does, is that like you gotta get through the setup really quick because there's a lot going on in a movie like this, and you want the movie to end and feel like it's a complete idea. Like when you get to the end of the movie, you want to feel like you saw Gamera, you understand what Gamera is, and you saw all the Gamera stuff that you need to see in one film. It's not like we're slowly building up to Gamera is going to be in this movie, and then you only really get good stuff with Gamera in the last 15 minutes. It's like, no, you get good Gamera shit in the first 10 minutes. And then, 20 minutes later, you get your big, great, like, kind of end of Act 1 giant monster scenes and stuff like that. And there's this efficiency through it that reminds me in the superhero world of like Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 1.
I was just about to say that.
Yeah, you're jumping between here's like a Gamera plot point, and then here is your Green Goblin, or here's your Gauss plot point, and you move between them. You kind of got some characters that are sort of in charge of either of those plots, and then eventually they intersect. And it's very similar to what Sam Raimi does in the first Spider-Man movie, where you've got all of your Peter Parker stuff. While the Peter Parker stuff is going, here's Norman Osborn and how he turns into the Green Goblin, and then those two sides intersect around the midpoint of the film. And that's just such a good, tight structure. And this movie does it even way better than Sam Raimi's Spider-Man does. Partially because I think it doesn't have quite as much baggage to get through as those movies plot-wise, because you don't have to
benefit this movie has is that your hero and your villain are not human beings who talk and have like rich emotional inner lives. So like Spider-Man is about a half hour longer than this, but I would say like there's a similar deftness in both cases. Like I think Spider-Man 1 is about as well as you can do it with human characters, and I think this is about as well as you can do it with kaiju characters, but they're very good comparisons because of that.
Yeah, and it's just the way in which it is able to balance these two plot points and then slowly intersect them. And when we talk about the third movie, I think the third movie does something very fun with playing off of that structure and kind of doing something more surprising with it. But you've got those, and you've got those sides building, and then you get like one of the best scenes in any of these movies, which is where all the shit comes out, and you've got all the humans are dealing with Gauss, and they have this great plan to catch the Gauss in the giant like domed baseball stadium.
Dome, yeah.
Yeah, and I love all the stuff of setting that up, and they've got all the meat that's been like doped with like sleeping stuff, and you've got all the fucking JSDF are there, the Japanese Self-Defense Force. They've got their cameras set up to deal with the Flash because they learned about that with the Gauss, and they have this like perfect plan all in place. Okay, this is how we're going to capture the Gauss. You've got the one asshole like environmentalist whatever dude who just wants the Gauss to capture them because he wants like the clout of capturing this thing rarer than the Japanese ibis or whatever, and all that stuff going on. And then, of course, Gamera comes marching into the city, and the whole plan goes to shit because Gamera's here. He's not here to capture whatever. He's here to fuck this shit up, blow it up with a giant fireball. And if the humans hadn't fucked around with it, honestly, Gamera probably would have finished the movie there. You could have just killed them all, and then we'd be done.
Gone back to the ocean and had a nap. Yeah. No, it is great, and it's the first place where I really noticed the location photography, because like that's the dome. They went there and shot there, and I think there's probably some studio stuff mixed in because you can't like wreck the fucking stadium. Yeah. And obviously there's a miniature version of it that like Gamera walks through. That's another thing, is that we're talking about the quality of the special effects, and we'll gush about this more later, but because Kaneko likes to shoot in all of these real locations, the miniatures have to do these perfect recreations of these real locations that are not just like on film identifiable, but the people in Japan watching will know pretty well because they like to go to identifiable places. And that's part of why the special effects are so amazing, is the match between them is so good. Like, everyone knows what that dome looks like, and they just build it perfectly and then have the guy in the Gamera suit crush it, and it's pretty seamless. And there's stuff like that is like really amazing, and I think doing that as your big kind of first act action scene really throws the gauntlet down.
Yeah, absolutely. You have that like fantastic shot from like inside the miniature dome looking up at the one gap, and Gamera comes in and looks over, and all of our like kind of human characters who have been doing on the Gauss storyline with our scientist lady look up and see him for the first time. Because you also have this great moment at the beginning of that sequence where you've got the sailor dude who's been following all the Gamera shit the whole time. He comes running in and he's like, no, you don't understand. A giant fucking turtle monster is on his way right here, right now. Like, I don't know what the fuck you guys are doing with some birds, but there's some other crazy shit going on. And everyone's like, what is this guy going on about? And then, of course, Gamera comes stomping through the city, shoots some giant giant fireballs. You just get all these little great moments of like the Gauss using their little sonic beam to cut the bars of their cage open. You have the one Gauss that like tries to charge at the military that just start firing their tranquilizers at it and flashing all the bulbs, and so you get this like great, like really harshly cut sequence that's very disorienting of that happening and the Gauss freaking out. And you also just get all these like incredible close-ups on the Gauss animatronics, because these are the little ones, so they're not the big suits, and the way in which like they move and the kind of creepy soullessness to those things. And there's just a fidelity to the movement of those animatronics that is so crisp and so like lifelike feeling that they really sell that those things are alive, and that also Gamera is this big living creature, even though the kinds of effects being used to realize those two creatures at that point in the movie are fairly different.
Well, this is something I want to talk about with the effects, which is, I mean, we just need to have the gushing session right now. So this is definitely a post-Jurassic Park movie. This is 1995, Jurassic Park is 93. No movie made after Jurassic Park that deals with anything resembling a giant monster doesn't take inspiration from Jurassic Park. And Jurassic Park is a masterpiece of effects work that uses puppets and animatronics and CGI, and it does all of them very well. You watch that movie today and every inch of it holds up and it's great. But I did watch this and think, I wonder if Jurassic Park would have been even better if they just committed to no CGI. Yeah. Not because the CGI in Jurassic Park is bad, and I think the shots where they use it are very, like, defensible. Like, the raptors in particular would have been really hard because of how fast they move. And that is something that Kaiju cannot do. Kaiju are not... That's why they are big, lumbering, brutes, is because of the effects used for them. But there's other ones where I'm just like, I wonder if if American filmmakers were more willing to use miniatures and use, like, you saying the word miniatures almost feels like it's selling this movie short, because the sets they've built in some cases are like, they must have taken up a whole soundstage. But like using that kind of stuff, because it works so well, it means that when you're looking at the monsters in most of these movies, other than some shots with Iris in movie 3, you're usually looking at something physical. Yeah. And there's something about seeing the physical texture of these things, seeing the physical textures of the things they are interacting with when they are smashing or walking through these big miniaturized sets, that like really blows me away. And I do think the moments in Jurassic Park that everyone most remembers tend to be the moments where they use the animatronics. Like, particularly the best scene in Jurassic Park, and one of the best scenes in Spielberg's career, is when the T-Rex comes at night and there's the two cars that are stopped on the tracks, and that is entirely animatronics and puppets. And like, that part of that is that when the T-Rex's eye comes down like next to the girl in the car, it is a physical T-Rex or T-Rex animatronic. And like, that's every scene with the effects in these, and that's part of why it just astonishes so much, is that like the amount of physical artistry on display, the tactility of it, like, it blew me away every time. Like, I would literally, like, my jaw would drop looking at some of these things they had designed, whether it is the Gamera suit, the animatronics on the Gauss, the animatronics on Gamera's face, and then all the things they are interacting with. And, maybe you need an appreciation of, like, model and miniature work, and I know some people don't have that, and some people would look at this and you can tell it's a miniature and a model in many shots. And, like, I think for you and me, we see that and we're like, this is cool as shit. And some people don't have that, and they should, because it's awesome. But, like, Lord of the Rings did a lot of this in the late 90s and early 2000s with miniature sets and things like this. And it's just, I feel like this was a weird fork in the road where I think too often today, it's not that CGI is bad, it's that we've decided to use it as a one-size-fits-all tool for everything. And there's just, these movies remind you of how many cases where not only would it be significantly cheaper not to use the CGI, but also, like, there are real benefits to doing it this way. And I think, particularly this first movie, just nails it every time, where you look at the physical shots of Gamera moving, with the guy in the suit and the miniature sets, or you look at the Gauss's animatronics, and there is no better way to do it. It doesn't matter, like, how long time progresses, how much better CGI gets, how much better new technologies we have. That is the best version of that shot. Just as in Jurassic Park, the scene with the T-Rex at night as an animatronic, there will never be a better version of that scene. Like, technology is not fully teleological where it's always getting better. That was the answer, and we got it. And it's so cool to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Like a movie it makes me think of also is John Carpenter's The Thing, in that sense of like, man, this is
Yes.
just like the pinnacle of this type of kind of special effects work. And for obviously John Carpenter's The Thing, it is also there mostly like puppets and then some animatronic stuff. And it's done at such a fidelity and a creativity. And there are just certain things that like there's a physical reality to it and a groundedness to it inherently by the fact that you're just shooting things that are actually there physically with a camera. You're just trying to use certain tricks to make those things appear larger or slightly different than they are in real life. And there's a tactility to it that is so vital. And it's why when you get something like a Shin Godzilla, even if they are using CGI, because there's certain things that CGI is able to do that if they did the giant suit, they wouldn't quite be able to do. They're trying to make the CGI look like it's a giant suit, right? They're trying to they're using that as a way to ground it in the environment and ground it in the shots. And absolutely, I just think that these movies, the special effects hold up so perfectly and they're so good and they feel so engaging and they just suck you into the world of the movie so vividly. And I think one of the things is that it also just gives the monsters a certain kind of character that I think is very hard for a lot of CG monsters to do. It's certainly what I feel like more of the legendary Godzilla movies. I think sometimes they have a hard time finding the kind of the soul of the monster and kind of having that come through. I think these movies are so good at doing that with Gamera and making him feel like there's something behind his eyes, and then contrast that with the things he's fighting where there's nothing behind the eyes, and that's why they're scary. There's this sort of pure animalistic quality to the Gyaos, and this almost kind of perverse animalism to the Gyaos, in that they are these self-reproducing, genetically created sort of pests that are going to wipe out the earth if we let them, and just destroy everything on the earth, because they are these kind of perversions of life. And you see that in the way, the kind of unnatural ways they move, and in this sort of alien feeling intelligence that's behind those weird puppet eyes. It's so perfectly executed with such artistry to try to tell the whole scope of the story and make these monsters feel real. And that's the whole point. That is why we're here. We're here to see a Gamera movie where Gamera fights a giant bird monster called the Gyaos. And everything is about selling that illusion and making that illusion feel tangible and real, and we can step into that world if we went into the movie.
Yes, and I think the Thing is a good comparison. These movies, some of the Millennium era Godzilla stuff,
yeah,
it kind of feels like looking at pixel art in fighting games on the Sega Saturn or something, where it's this was the peak of this thing. This is and we made the horrible decision of not continuing it to today because it could have gotten even better. But it's just something about this. It is a technically old school style of visualization, but at a level of execution that kind of boggles the mind, and it's just, there's moments where when Gamera gets stabbed by a tusk or something and he's bleeding out and it's real green paint or whatever they have on the suit. I'm sorry, CGI has been around for a long time. I feel like I can confidently say there will never be a CGI shot of a monster getting stabbed that will feel as visceral as that, because the eye just knows. It just knows. There is something about having a suit that is a physical thing and a guy reacting in it and then actual physical paint coming out, and an animator isn't having to figure out, well, how does the blood fall out of the wound in a way that feels realistic and interacts with the texture. It just does that, and the camera just captures it, and the suit is made with a level of fidelity that you go, no, Gamera, no! And I feel like a CGI Gamera, there's probably a lot of cool things you could do, but you couldn't do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's another example for my Ultraman people. I'm most of the way through Ultraman Tiga. And there's a thing that early in Ultraman Tiga, they made a critical mistake that luckily they fixed, because Ultraman Tiga is a great show, but there's one thing that they fucked up on early on, which is when Ultraman would beat the monster and he'd shoot his giant laser beam or whatever to defeat the monster, they would do this thing where they'd do this kind of digital effect where the monster would disintegrate, and it's this sort of fairly cheesy looking 90s TV CGI where the suit disintegrates. I'm like, no, what? No, because the thing that happens at the end of an Ultraman fight like 90% of the time is Ultraman shoots his specium beam or whatever special move this Ultraman has. It hits the monster, and then they cut to a shot, usually probably of a model. Sometimes it's of the actual suit, but usually they made a little like model of the suit, and they cut to it, and immediately as soon as they cut to the shot of the little model thing, they blow it the fuck up. And it's a little like it's made of styrofoam or whatever, but they just explode it with actual explosive, and they just blow the thing up on camera, and it's great every fucking time because they actually blew a little fucking thing up, and you get to see it fly apart, and part of it gets set on fire as it's twisting through the air, and it's like a real explosion. And there's just an impact to seeing that I don't care how good your fucking CG explosion is, and their CG explosions were bad in the early Ultraman Tiga. They're really explosions. They're good for a different kind of style of effect, but there's just a lack of a punch or an impact to it. Or if like you're trying to get a good impact to it with CGI, it feels like you're having to do so much work to try to sell that. But it's like, just fucking blow the thing up. And it's like in Gamera, it's like, why you don't need to have like a big CG monster knock over a big CG building. Get a dude in a suit. It's not as big of as a real building, but it's a big fucking miniature building, and you just have the dude smash it to fucking smithereens, and there's a physicality to it that's so primal, and it's so fun, and it just like tickles the little child in your heart of like, yes, I want to see things blow up. I want to see things get smashed. I want to see like big goopy weird blood come out of like the monster or whatever. I want to see parts of it get ripped off, which is also like, all the best giant monster movies have like the most Ultraman thing Gamera does in any of these movies is he rips off the two big like antennas or whatever on Legion in the second movie. Like, I want to see those things and see them get ripped apart and broken up and stuff like that, because it feels like I can feel it. I can reach out and touch it. It's a real thing. You're not having to try to sell the illusion with digital effects in that way. And yeah, it is just the thing that is a particular pleasure of these movies, is that they are just the best these kinds of effects have ever looked. And I've watched basically every fucking movie you can watch that uses this kind of special effects. This is the best it gets, is in these three films.
And increasingly most TV episodes.
Yes, yeah, I'm getting there. I'm not quite there yet, but I'm getting there.
No, but it's great. I mean, look, dynamite, paint, these are cheap things, but we haven't come up with something better. There's just no replacement for a stick of dynamite and a rubber suit. It's just like, I think some of it is that it's easy to overthink this, of being like, well, we have, amazing technology with subsurface scattering and no, just get the stick of dynamite. Just do it. It's fine.
Just blow it the fuck up. It's fine. It looks great.
It does. And obviously what they're doing here is sophisticated, not just in that sense, but it is the way the sets are built. I'm sure there's all sorts of things they've built in there to get the camera positions that they're getting, because that's amazing in all of this. And you were talking about that. And I don't know if I was as attuned to it because I haven't seen as many of these movies, but I've seen enough to know what's good and what isn't. And like, holy shit, like, when the monsters are on screen, I do feel like it's not just that the effects are good, but every shot is maximizing what is good about those effects, which is, to me, half of what effects work is. And it's why a lot of effects work in Hollywood today is bad, is because the filmmakers don't know what to do with it. The effects artists are perfectly capable, but they haven't been given the shots and the editing that you need to like make it sing. And of course these movies do that beautifully.
Yeah, well, and like basically every last motherfucker on the production of this movie is a massive fan of these kinds of movies since they were a little kid, and their dream has been to work on a movie like this. So it's like, everybody working on this movie is so knowledgeable about the roots of the genre and where it comes from and how you do these kinds of shots, how you do these kinds of effects. So you don't have the problem that you can get with a CGI-driven movie, where the director of a CGI-driven movie can get away with directing the movie and not know a thing about how the effects are going to work. And that's how a lot of the Marvel stuff ends up happening. And you've got a effects team that the director has maybe like never or barely even met, that they've been working on a thing maybe before the director was even hired. And they've already been building like the big, spectacle action scene at the midpoint of the movie or whatever. You don't have that here, right? Like, Kaneko is just as important to getting the effects work to happen as Higuchi, even if Higuchi's a special effects director, because it's all fully integrated into the whole production. And that's the only way you can get the kind of realism that this gets. Because another big scene, if we're thinking about like shooting on location and blending that with the giant monster stuff, the next big giant monster scene after the dome scene is where they're evacuating that little village and they're running across the bridge, and Gauss comes in and is gonna seemingly like kill this little kid, and then Gamera comes in and blocks it. And the way that that scene is shot, like you've seen vaguely scenes like this in like every giant monster movie. I mean, this is like how it always happens. The first scene usually you have in like a small town, that like a relatively smaller city location, where the monsters first come in and fuck shit up a little bit. Then you've got another scene that's probably going to be in like a more mountainous or like empty field kind of area, and then at the end of the movie at night, they're going to be in another like more populated giant like city area, probably Tokyo. I think that's how this usually goes. But the way that this version of the we're in a mountainous region scene is shot and integrated, where you have our principal main character, like human actors are there, they're on the bridge, they're underneath Gamera, like just the way that they sell all of that, and they're blending different kinds of shots or incorporating the giant monster shots in with shots with the human people, and then using clever editing tricks, and how perfectly they have done the miniature recreation of that whole area with the shots with Gauss and Gamera. Like, it's all just perfectly blended. And that's a thing that those kinds of scenes are not normally shot that way, because usually you have the human people on the cliffside over there, and they're looking over and being like, oh my god, it's Godzilla, it's Gamera, oh holy shit, and they're looking at it, but they're not like physically there. They're not getting like drenched in Gamera blood, you're not having all that happen at the same time. And the way of just how perfectly it's interacted, it's so good, that like you just don't even think about it when you're watching it. You're not thinking about the fact that these people and the giant monster thing are obviously not in the same place at the same time, but they sell the effects so perfectly, you just don't ever question it.
You mentioned the Marvel thing, and it's something I've thought, at some point I feel like I should write something about this, because it's a radical assertion I'm about to make, but I think it's one that needs to be made at some point, which is that most of the people credited as director on Marvel movies, I would argue didn't direct the movies. Mm-hmm. I think in terms of how if you want to give an actual definition of what a movie director does, most of those people did not direct those movies, because if all you're doing is being on set, calling action and cut, and working with actors a little bit, I don't think you directed the movie. I think directing the movie involves all the pre-production, it involves the storyboarding, it involves the shot choices, and it involves all the effects. Why does Avatar look so good where most movies look bad today? It's because James Cameron is in there inventing the technology alongside the people who are doing it. Like, every shot is going through that person. And that is the kind of thing that, like, these movies and other great kaiju movies, Godzilla -1 from last year, a really good example with CG effects, the person credited as director directed the fucking movie. They were there at the beginning, and they made all the choices, and they followed through to the end. That's what directing is. And, like, this is part of what makes these movies feel like, the Gamera movies feel like a breath of fresh air for us as people who've lived through the last 20 years of Hollywood, is they're directed. Kaneko's hand is, like, obvious in there, and Higuchi's hand as the effects director, but they're clearly working hand in hand, and there's an intentionality to it. And I agree. I think on a pure effects level, that scene you're mentioning with the bridge and the forest and everything might be the most astonishing, because it is the most like, well, yeah, you can double a city in miniatures. We've seen that before. I think it's done better here than I've ever seen it, but we know what that looks like. I feel like the amount of like how good they match all of that is like kind of unprecedented in that scene.
Yeah, and like the lighting is so particular. Like, it's because it's not the sort of like perfectly kind of flat mid-noon lighting that those kinds of scenes typically go for in your giant monster movie. Like, it's more kind of like, oh, we're getting close to sunset, and it's got a little bit of that kind of golden quality to the lighting and stuff like that. It's just, yeah, it's so impressive. And it's also, I love that scene also just gets you that really great moment with Gamera intentionally defending the little kid and blocking the laser from hitting the little kid, and it gives you that extra little characterization of Gamera where it's like, I think part of the heart of these movies is that I don't know how much Gamera cares about like adult humans. He's not trying to kill them on purpose. I don't think if he particularly cares about them, but he cares about the kids because the kids are the hope, right? They're like the future. And I like that like element here, and how they've taken a thing that is sort of, I think, just a sort of element of the old movies because it's the thing you do, in the same way that Ultraman shows typically were like, this stops with Tia, but all the old Ultraman shows would always have at least one little kid as part of the main cast, because that's what you do to have like your Robin-esque character that little kids can be like, and I'm a member of the super science team too. And I get to go on the adventures also, right? And project yourself onto those characters. It's just kind of like an old school 60s, 70s way of doing that kind of thing. And it happened in comic books, it happened in TV shows, it happened in movies. Eventually you kind of moved away from that being the thing you do, is you have a little kid character for the kids to project themselves onto. And so here they've taken that little kind of quirk of the old Gamera movies to appeal to the demographic and made it part of the kind of philosophy of the character and of the movie, that he is the guardian of children, and that's something that means something. And you get that kind of, I think, really kind of clearly expressed in that scene on the bridge, that's where Gamera goes in and he lets himself get physically hurt pretty bad just to help this one little, like, 6-year-old boy.
Yes. Again, you could rewrite that scene with Superman, and
yes.
it would be pretty easy. You wouldn't have to do a lot of rewriting. It just gets those. That's because I think when we did a top 10 superhero list a couple years ago, you put these on there.
Yes.
And I think to someone who hadn't seen the movies, that maybe sounded weird, but having seen them now, I totally get what you were going for there. Because yes, these are. I mean, he fucking flies like Superman. And obviously, like, it's a clear call to that. And, he's got his fucking, like, arms outstretched with his, like, rocket boosters, which Superman doesn't have that. But, it's amazing.
It would be better if Superman had those, if that's how he flew. If he just had little like jets of air just shot out of his feet. Not that he had like it wasn't like he wore boots. It just shot out of nowhere. That would be fucking sick.
I think it would also be sick if Superman had to, like, spin in a horizontal circle to, like, go really fast and fly up and away like he's a UFO. I also love that goofy thing because you can imagine a reboot of Gamera ditching some of that if they wanted to be taken quote unquote seriously. And I do love and I haven't seen the old Gamera movies, but I know moments, I know the reputation, and I do love their commitment to taking all those pieces and finding a place for it here. You were just talking about that with, like, how does it approach his relationship to children, but I think in the effects you see that too. Another thing I want to talk about in the storytelling is the lore in these movies.
Yes.
It's fucking weird. It's not ever quite fully explained, which I actually think is part of why it works. There isn't, like, an excessive focus on it, but it's there. Obviously, the most we get is with Asagi and her, like, spiritual relationship to Gamera. But even there, I like that they don't over-explain these things. I think the third movie runs into a little bit of trouble with, like, the weird conspiracy guy and whatever he's up to, and by the end of the movie, I did not fully understand what was going on. But in the first two, and particularly with Asagi, I like that it's there, but it's also, the movie never, like, grinds to a halt to have someone pull out the whiteboard and be like, now we'll tell you about Atlantis. I like that. I like that it's just like, these people are busy, they're trying to fight the Gauss, we can get our little lore kind of on the side as like a sprinkling on top, but it's not going to grind the movie to a halt. That feels like a screenwriter who knows what they're doing.
Yeah, I love the fucking lore of these movies, because I think it's so enticing, because they just give you that taste, and it's very evocative of, you can kind of picture that, oh, there was this ancient human civilization or whatever, Atlantis, that had this, like, amazing technology. Somehow they ended up creating the Gauss. Who knows why? And this is like, I think the idea of the weird game designer dude in the third movie is that, like, I think he's a person who thinks he understands all these things, and he just doesn't understand shit. And so he just gets killed, kind of unceremoniously in a way at the end of that movie. Because it's like, we can make assumptions about why the Gauss were created by this ancient civilization, but we really have no idea actually why. All we know is that the end result is that they created these things that are aberrations of nature. They self-reproduce, and they sort of, like, self-mutate in these, like, very bizarre ways. It's a very, like, 1990s, like, obsession with, like, genetic modification and stuff like that that's present in a lot of sci-fi around that time. Instead of it being nuclear nonsense, it's weird genetic modified nonsense. But here I do think they grounded enough in, like, plausibility, and then being able to have the sort of fantasy element of Atlantis there to sell the idea of the Gauss. I love that there's the sense of, oh, there are probably Gauss eggs everywhere, but they just haven't hatched yet, because we're just hitting this threshold where humanity has changed the environment enough to create an environment that the Gauss have been waiting for. And then you've got Gamera is like the hope of that ancient civilization. They made this one guardian in the shape of a turtle, right? Which is like, turtles are defensive. It's like Genbu from Chinese/Japanese mythology, the Guardian of the North, which they actually incorporate slightly into the third movie. But that they built this like, ancient guardian who has slumbered alongside waiting for the Gyaos to awaken. And as soon as like the Gyaos are awakening again, then Gamera comes back up. And then that's when, humanity discovers him, and he has that connection to humanity through the Magatama, the curved jewel that Asagi has. And just, it's like, as I say, they don't get super in the weeds on it. You don't have a giant exposition scene going over it, because the exposition you have is also the characters not really expositing to us. It's them trying to put together puzzle pieces, and they don't have all the pieces to the puzzle yet. And so that lets the audience draw a lot of conclusions. But I think it's one of the things that's really rewarding about rewatching these movies multiple times is you're able to sort of like question the lore a little bit. It's got enough gaps where it feels like you can kind of see that there's this bigger picture there, but you can't quite get it. I'd almost like equate it to sort of like playing the Dark Souls games or something like that, where you know that there's this bigger history here, but you just don't quite have full access to it. And there's something about that that's very rich. And as a fan of giant monster stuff, it's also just really fun because it's got such a different flavor to it than Godzilla movies. Like, no Godzilla movie is going to go for this. Like, you're not going to have weird genetically engineered bat monsters and that Godzilla was some ancient guardian from Atlantis. Like, that's just not ever going to be there because this just doesn't fit the vibe of Godzilla, even if you're doing a big reboot of a Godzilla movie. And so they're able to just kind of go in some very different places. And they're pulling from some vague elements from the old Gamera movies, but a lot of this is them kind of like going off on their own and making their own version of Gamera that it's very distinctive ultimately from what the old version of Gamera was.
Yes, and I like all that, and I'm glad you were able to say all that, Sean, because obviously after one viewing of each, I couldn't have said it that coherently, because it is a little confusing, but you've spent a lot of time watching these movies, and I agree, it's something I would like to rewatch them for, is getting a better sense of all of that, and I do, even just watching them the first time, I liked that sense of, it's this theme that has, like, again, the legendary monster movies use this very heavily, which is like if the humans pollute or abuse the environment enough, then the monsters come out, and that's what this is with the Gyaos and with Gamera, but I do think those movies can ladle it on a little thick, and I think once you're getting into, like, we have to justify all of it. Then, like, that, I think that second Godzilla movie from the US, the one that's called King of the Monsters, is, like, you could cut 45 minutes of exposition out of that movie. It is so over the top with how much time they have to spend justifying it all. I think once you get into all the Hollow Earth stuff, that can be a little fun, but also at that point, the metaphor has become its own thing, and whatever applicability it had to our present day situation is now gone because we're fully on this, like, B-movie sci-fi ride. And I think there's, like, the balance that they have in these Gamera movies is kind of just right for those sorts of ideas to make it evocative and applicable to present day life, but also not drown the movie in that, at which point it becomes not applicable.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I love that you never, like, find the ruins of Atlantis or something, right? The closest you get is you have the Gamera graveyard at the beginning of the third movie, which is a great scene. But you don't have, like, here's an ancient Atlantean who has come back to life, or, the kinds of things I feel like maybe if they had made a whole bunch of these movies afterwards, eventually they would have to go there. I feel like that's where these ancient civilization style stories always end up at. It's kind of like in Halo when 343 took over. Eventually, like, oh, now we gotta have a Forerunner dude here because we can't just have it be like sort of weird intimations of what this ancient civilization was. We have to have it be very present and in your face. And I like that here. It's like, no, like, we don't really know. We don't know how they were wiped out. We don't know why. We can just put together the puzzle pieces and try to figure out how do we survive now and not repeat the mistakes that they made, because we are pushing ourselves on our own path to destruction, seemingly the same way that they must have as well. And yeah, I think that it does a good job of having the environmentalist style message there, but it's not preachy about it. It's more just that the environmentalism is there baked into the nature of what they present the Gyaos as being and what they present Gamera as being. And so all the environmentalism is delivered through the action of those characters of the monsters and how they're characterized, and then also with Gamera through his relationship with Asagi, representing, the sort of like the hope of the future and all those kinds of things. That's just baked into the plot in the action. It is not a thing that is exposited to you. It is mostly like near the end of the movie, the first movie, the second movie, both have kind of a kiss-off line that more directly nods to the environmentalism thing, but it's not a thing that the movie is laying on super thick.
All right, what else do we want to say about this first movie? Because we do have two others to talk about.
Yes. The whole ending is fucking incredible. All the shit of Gauss fucking destroying the top half of the Tokyo Tower and making a nest on there. Just, like, it's the best shot in any of these movies to me is that one big wide shot of Gauss perched on top of the ruins of the Tokyo Tower. So fucking good. It's such an iconic moment. I love that. And then everything in the ending where you have Gamera come in fighting Gauss, you've got your, Christ-like resurrection of Gamera that has to happen at least once in these movies. And all that stuff is
all the air battle stuff.
Yes.
Like the Japanese title of this movie translates to Gamera Giant Monster Midair Battle, and there's a good reason for that, because the ending of this, and again, it's mostly with practical effects, but this is the kind of stuff you don't expect to see kaiju doing, because they're people in suits, they have to be earthbound. But, like, it's very impressively done. And again, could be a Superman action sequence.
Yeah. I mean, you've got the huge giant dive bomb at the end that happens there. And so Gauss cuts off its own leg with its giant laser to escape, which is a thing that kind of gets echoed in the third movie that Gamera does with his arm.
Thomas made me rewind that because we were watching it. It's like, what the fuck did the Gauss just do to itself? And we went back and watched it again. And then it's like, because it's like it goes fast, but it's like a brutal thing that suddenly happens. It's so good.
Yeah, and then I love you've got the little fucking face-off at the end after Gamera's been resurrected from the fires, and then they have a little, like, stare down, and Gauss shoots its laser, and Gamera shoots his fucking giant fireball and kills Gauss.
It's the Dragon Ball Z sequence. It's like Gohan defeating Perfect Cell, where they have their beams, but Gamera's is stronger, and so he wins.
It's just the ending of the movie is fucking incredible, and then you've got all the human characters watching on as Gamera goes in the fires, and Asagi, her connection to Gamera has been severed. It's phenomenal. I do also want to shout out before we move on to the second movie, while they're not the sort of things that stand out in your memory as much as Gamera or Gauss, all the human people are so good in these movies, and the human drama around them investigating and putting together what's happening here is so well done. And I do think all the actors just do a very, very good job. Although I particularly like it's the character Masaki Saito, who's played by the actor Hirotaro Honda. He's the guy for the Japan Environment Agency, who's like the quote-unquote like bad guy amongst the humans here, who's like very resistant to their plans to deal with the Gauss. And I love that everybody else is giving a fairly like naturalistic feeling performance. And it feels like this one dude has been directed to just be an absolute asshole and really chew the scenery. And it works so well. I fucking love that dude and I love that character. And it's one of my favorite things in the third movie is that they bring him back. But he's like kind of a good dude now, even if he's still a smarmy asshole. It's fucking
He's
great.
Walter Peck from Ghostbusters, right?
Yes.
He's like the EPA dude from Ghostbusters. Totally.
It's so good. And I love that dude, and every time he's on screen and how much he chews the scenery, it's fucking great.
Great stuff. Also, each one of these movies does have a vocal theme song, and they're all good, but the one for this movie kicks fucking ass. I love it. I was just obsessed with it to listen to it at the end, and it's such a good, like, the energy of the movie. You come out of that movie on a fucking high, and then you get a great song. Wonderful. Love it.
Yep. Absolutely phenomenal. All right, let's talk now about Gamera 2, Attack of Legion.
Or Legion,
yes,
as they say it.
Yes, although it obviously is supposed to be Legion because this is where if you were like, oh, there's some sort of vaguely Christ-like elements to Gamera in Gamera 1. It is they're not being subtle here. I mean, there's a long, proper history of like weird Christian symbolism in giant monster stuff because Tsuburaya Eiji, who is the special effects director on the original Godzilla movie and many of the early Godzilla movies, who then started his own company, Tsuburaya Productions. That's the company that made Ultraman. He was converted to a Catholic. And so there is a lot of Catholic subtext to Ultraman, the being of light who comes down and inhabits the form of a human being to live among us. Every season of Ultraman in all the old Ultraman shows has at least one big 2-part episode where Ultraman is crucified at the end of the first part. Like, that literally happens in every one of them, and it's great. So it's, if you're wondering, where does all the weird Christian shit in Neon Genesis Evangelion come from? It comes from Anno being a big Ultraman fan and just pulling that straight. Yes. It's just all Ultraman shit. And it's also here in Gamera, though in like a slightly different form. And I think in actually like a very effective form. I'm kind of making fun of the Ultraman stuff, which can get pretty goofy. Here, like, I think they do a very good job of actually taking the sort of essence of the messianic, like, figure and imbuing those qualities into Gamera. So he's not just a Jesus Christ metaphor or anything like that, but they're taking some of those things that's effective about the Jesus story of this like heroic figure that's fighting for not just humanity, but something like bigger, something more spiritual that we can all believe in, even if like the other people in the world can't see it. And those elements of his like death and resurrection in the second movie, like I think those are all actually like really well integrated parts into the plot that make it very compelling, and it understands the substance of what makes that story structure and archetype work, and it uses it phenomenally well. And then you just layer on top of that the fact that you have named the villain after a biblical concept, and you have a dude like dramatically quote the Bible when they name Legion. That's just a way to like nod very directly to where I think some of those tropes come from.
Oh, totally agree. So yeah, I thought this was probably my least favorite of the three, but I don't want that to mean like I don't like it. I thought it was great. It's tons of fun. And like, I think if it has anything it suffers from is kind of just comparison to the first movie.
Yeah.
In that movie kind of hits that formula perfectly. The third movie is very smart in going in a very different direction, so you're not actively comparing them much at all. This movie is kind of in between those. I do like what it does new, though. Like, I have not seen a kaiju movie where the main monster is fighting something like the Legion. Like, it's a really smart choice of villain, because usually the kaiju are good at fighting other big kaiju that they can fight like a pro wrestler or something, right? But here you have all these little fucking annoying bugs, and they can cover up Gamera, and I did fucking stand up and cheer early on when he gets covered by the bugs, and I went, oh, he's totally gonna have to get in the air and spin to get the bugs off, right? And then he did it, and I was so happy. And that's, again, these Gamera movies all turn us into little kids going, yeah, Gamera! But you've got that thing with, he's fighting these crazy fucking bug monsters, and so it's a very different, like, valence of that. And the other thing in terms of locations is that it's all set until the third act. It's mostly set in northern Japan, where it's wintry. It's like Sapporo, it's Sendai, and so there's a lot of snow on the ground, and they have to match that in the effects stuff. I haven't seen a lot of kaiju movies that do much in winter, because that's harder to match, but it makes this movie look and feel very distinctive. Like, this movie feels cold and wintry and all of that, and it's super cool.
Yeah. I think, it definitely, this movie is only sort of lesser because you have that first movie to compare it to, and it just can't quite match up to that. But this is, like, I think the most interesting version of the giant monster from space version of your giant monster story, which is, it's one of your kind of primary variants. You either have your, like, nuclear-born monster, you've got your underground monster, or you've got your space monster. And here they make it into like a full, proper, classic space invasion style story. And I do think that like Legion is one of the most interesting monsters in any really giant monster movie in terms of how kind of well thought out it is as this like alien life form. Where it's got this whole like complex life cycle where you've got these little like kind of like larva things that build this like huge nest that's this giant flowering plant, and that flowering plant produces all of this oxygen that then is going to detonate that oxygen to shoot a seed onto another planet. And so they just kind of germinate these planets as they go along. And you obviously have like the giant monstrous Legion thing that it makes as a way to try to defend the plant once Gamera gets involved. But I love all those little weird details. The fact that they're kind of like silicon-based life forms, so they like eat silicate and dissolve it. So they like attack the beer factory or whatever where the detective from the first movie has now worked at. You have that great scene where he's talking to his buddy about like, oh yeah, well, I used to be a cop on this one island and all the Gauss shit happened, and I kind of got PTSD from that. So now I'm like working here in this beer factory in Sapporo, and then the bugs attack. It's like, oh shit. But
to be fair, that guy, I think, not knowing there would be alien bugs that eat silicate, he made the right choice. That is probably the right place to go if you want to get away from your giant monster PTSD. Beer factory in Sapporo, I think he had a good plan, and it's part of what makes it so sad that he gets attacked again.
Yes, and and I love that they go and they eat the bottles and leave all the beer behind, which is just, it's such a good detail. You've got all the shit where like they don't have muscles, they just move their bodies through compressed gas.
Yeah,
so good. Yeah, because they like have the one scene where they like dissect it and figure that out, and then that comes in again at the end where you have the one military dude has to go into that one plant where they're trying to attract all the little legion, and there's the one that's in there and he has to shoot it, and it's just spewing fucking gas all over the place. Just that stuff and putting the pieces together over like, what is the Legion? Like, how do they function as a life form? Like, that to me is like the thing that's most impressive about the second movie, or the thing that gives it its own unique flavor, is that it has such a well thought out kind of idea behind this monster, and you're kind of figuring out how it works. And then in the background of all that, you've got Gamera coming in and trying to fight it. And as you say, like, Gamera is struggling to find a way to deal with this different kind of creature that is not the thing that Gamera was designed to fight. Gamera was built to kill Gauss. That's why Gamera exists. So, but now he's trying to defend the Earth from this like strange thing. And yeah, one of the most fucked up scenes in any giant monster movie, I think, is that one early on where all the little Legion come out and they just crawl all over Gauss or all over Gamera and start biting him, and he starts bleeding. And then he does the thing that you said where he gets up and spins and flies away and spins them off, but he also spews us like a thin spray of blood all over the place that like cakes the window that the people are standing behind. Like, man, that shit's so good. That's one of those details we're talking about. How did they use like the direction and everything to ground these scenes and all that together? Like, that's one of those little moments that you can zoom in on to see what are those tricks that they do, is having the people watching it through the window. That's totally normal. You see that in every giant monster movie, is a shot of people standing in a building looking at the giant monster stuff through a window. But then having the blood shoot out and spray across the window to ground that these are two things happening in the same place at the same time. That's like that extra touch that this team has in all these scenes all over the place. That just, it's those juicy details that make everything gel together. It's so good.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this movie is, like, I think in terms of the kind of the procedural elements of all the scientists and military people having to figure out what is going on with the thing, it's very good at that. Maybe the best version of that kind of thing I've ever seen. I do think, like, it becomes, I don't know if it gets too excessive, but you do notice that this movie's about 5 minutes longer than the first one, and I feel some places where like it sags a little bit, or like I kind of want to get back to Gamera because there's so much to figure out with the Legion. But again, I don't know if I would have that complaint at all if I weren't watching this the night after watching Gamera 1. It's a very good version of what it's doing, and neither 2 or 3 are quite as tight as that first movie, but I think it is hard to replicate something that tight. This is still very good on its own terms. I like the human characters here too. Again, I think it's just like a little bit less than I like them in 1 and 3. I think 3 probably has the richest human cast because it brings back kind of the best characters from the first one, and then it has kind of our most significant focus on a character at all, which is the little girl, teenage girl in the third movie who lost her family. But I like the main characters here. I like you've got the military dude and the scientist lady, and they are both fun to watch here.
Yes, they're very good. And I like you bring back Asagi, who she's in there in like kind of the second half of the movie. I mean, you've got...
Although it's a that is the most like sequel-esque thing they do, which is that, I'm going north to ski, and Gamera appeared. And like, it's so flagrant, you can't be mad at it or anything, but it is very funny of like, how do we get Asagi into this movie? She's skiing. Let's do it. And I do love it. That feels like a 90s Hollywood sequel kind of thing, and it's great.
Well, it's more than that, because it's that she was going to go to Hokkaido to ski, and then like the flight ends up not being able to go because Legion is there, but then Legion comes down to Sendai, which is where she was diverted to. So it's like, and that's where all the stuff intersects. And that's where you do also have some fucking wild shit that happens where you've got the whole like sort of ticking time bomb thing that happens in this movie where you've got the giant nest that if it launches, it will just destroy Hokkaido. You've got that one great scene where they have the computer simulation running. This is another super Spielbergian feeling moment
totally.
where they run the computer simulation and they see it and the little like red sphere starts going and it gets bigger and bigger and then bigger and bigger and bigger. And like eventually the computer can't calculate it because it's so big. And she's like asks the one dude, it's like, so like, it's like, oh, well, it would destroy all of Hokkaido. It's like, oh God. That shit's so good. And so you've got that early on. Gamera stops it. Then they build a second one in Sendai, and that's the one where Gamera like gets there just in time where he knocks it over, but then the whole thing explodes, and Gamera's just at the heart of a nuclear fucking explosion, which has one of my favorite shots in any of these movies. It's the shot of Gamera in the explosion, like shouting as he's getting like kind of blown away. And this is where you get your whole Christ thing of where you have this giant Gamera carcass and then all the children go and have like a wake for Gamera and their like hopes and dreams of the children. And then later in the third one, they contextualize it also as like the mana of Earth, like the life energy of the Earth comes and brings Gamera back. And then Gamera beats Legion with basically a Gamera version of the Spirit Bomb. And it's fucking great.
It's so good. That middle part is also, for one, the entire sequence in Sendai is unreal.
Yeah.
Like, the scale of the destruction that they show in that scene is like, I mean, it's totally on par with like Godzilla -1 or something like that, where you show the full destruction of a city and it's like both horrifying and thrilling. Amazing. It is also where I realized, oh, this could be a Superman script so easily, because the shot where Gamera gets like irradiated by the bomb is so close to that shot in The Dark Knight Returns, or that panel where Superman stops the nuke and like gets blown away. And then, in the Superman version of this movie, he would have to fly into space and be bathed in the sun's rays, and then he would come back down. And when he is bathed in the sun's rays, he would hold his arms out like he's being crucified, and we would have our Jesus pose, and then he would come back down. But it is the same basic idea, and I just love it. It's so close to like that story structure. Seriously, James Gunn, I know you're making your Superman movie. If you need an idea for Superman 2, I think you could maybe buy the rights from Toho/Daiei and just say, could I make Superman 2 Attack of Legion? Because I think it could be pretty good.
Yes. And then you can have like how Gamera defeats Legion, where he absorbs like the hopes and dreams of all of humanity, and then his entire chest just opens up and fires a giant laser.
So cool.
It's so fucking cool. It's like everything about the last fight in this movie kicks ass. I mean, the fights in all the movies kick ass, but you have just that shift of where the military is trying to like sort of stop Gamera for a lot of it, and then that shift into them being like, no. It's like we have to, where it's all of humans, like all of Earth has to go and fight Legion, and then Gamera teaming up with all of Japan and fighting the Legion and then fucking it up. And I think I already mentioned where he rips off the fucking antennas and all that stuff, and Legion freaks the fuck out and then shoots the weird like red lasers through Gamera. It's just, it's cool.
I love
shit.
Those red lasers. Yeah, it's so cool. And that, the money shot of Gamera opening his chest and having this incredible energy burst, like, that might be like the money shot of the trilogy. It's literally, Arrow did a steel book. Arrow has a set with all the Gamera movies, but they did a steel book that's just these three. I don't own that, but the cover of it is that shot. And it is like a steel book, embossed version of Gamera's chest and the energy coming out. Like, holy cow, that's a great ending.
Yeah, it's awesome. So yeah, it's like, I absolutely agree that the movie drags in certain places. I think the thing the movie struggles with is like, it's trying to replicate the structure of the first movie where you've got the Gamera story and the Legion thing, but like, there's just not much of a Gamera story to be told because we already know who Gamera is. And I think that's the thing the movie struggles with, that sags the pacing. But when the movie hits those big moments where everything has locked into place, it absolutely is fucking awesome. And so it's still one of the best giant monster movies. It just doesn't, I think they couldn't quite figure out how to replicate the thing the first movie did, because I just don't think you quite can with the sequel. And so it ends up not having anything to quite replace that sort of Gamera plotline the first movie had.
And the third movie solves this, I
think.
Because the third movie is so smart. And the other thing about the third movie is that it is basically the good version of Batman v Superman. And this blew me away from basically the opening scene, because it's so direct. It's so direct because it does the same thing. If you remember, the very bad movie Batman v Superman opens with Bruce Wayne on the ground in Metropolis during the action climax of Man of Steel, where Superman and Zod are destroying all the buildings, and it reframes Superman's heroism from that movie as horror to Bruce Wayne on the ground as he's trying to save people. And it does the same thing in Gamera 3, where our main character, Ayana Hirasaka, she loses her family, and in the first scene of the movie, we see that it was during, as Gamera was kind of, he's not rampaging, he's just trying to get to fighting the Gauss, but he winds up, again, not intentionally, but also he's not, trying to get out of the way that much, winds up killing her family, and so she grows up with this, revenge motivation against Gamera, and in the movie is doing what Bruce Wayne is doing in Batman v Superman of trying to figure out, how do I kill Gamera? And she winds up, one of her buddies is the heir to an old mystical place in lots of lore, and she winds up creating this monster named Iris, and she gives it her, vengeful spirit, and then at the end, down to Batman v Superman has the whole thing where he gets stabbed with the spear of Longinus like he's Jesus Christ, and this movie ends with Gamera having his hand speared by Iris, which he then cuts off to fight.
Yeah.
It's so direct. It's the same group of ideas that Batman v Superman is trying to deal with of well, how do you account for the collateral damage that the hero causes? And this movie, I think, actually cashes that check, where Batman v Superman has no good answer for it and never really figures it out. Because also, the person doing it is Batman, who's also just killing people left and right in that movie, which is maybe a problem given the theme of the film. But I was kind of blown away by how directly, obviously the two movies were not made in relation to each other at all, but there is something that is so clear, in the future, if I need to explain how Batman v Superman could have been better, I can just show Gamera 3 Revenge of Iris, because that's it. This is the good version of that story.
Yeah, I had not thought about that, but you're 100% right. It is trying to do the same sort of thing that Batman v Superman did, only here it's very successful. And I think there's a lot of crazy things about this movie. I love how fucking wild this movie goes and how big of a swing it takes. And one of those is just saying hey, Gamera doing this shit is going to have collateral damage, which is a thing that the first two movies don't really dwell on much. Although the scene that they recontextualize in the third one is a thing that happens in the first Gamera movie. If you go back and rewatch Gamera 1, Gamera Guardian of the Universe, there is a moment where Gamera, Gauss is in Tokyo, Gamera lands, and then Gamera charges through a building to get to Gauss, and so it's that is the same building. So they kind of reproduce that shot, though they have two new Gamera costumes for this one, because they have a new main Gamera that is slightly redesigned to be a little bit edgier looking, but then you've got this really fucked up gnarly looking Gamera. That's the one that Ayana sees in her flashback, that I believe is meant to replicate a little bit of the look of the big animatronic head in the original Godzilla that looks up over the hill, and it's one of the first shots you get of Godzilla in the original one. It's so similar of an aesthetic. That flashback at the beginning is all shot in black and white, which is one of the things that gives it that look. I believe that is part of what they're kind of visually pulling from here. So you have this whole motivation of Ayana being someone who inevitably, Gamera fighting in these big cities is going to lead to Gamera killing people. But in the first two movies, they make a really clear point to have all the places where Gamera fights be evacuated. So there are long sequences of all those people being evacuated from Tokyo, all the people being evacuated from Hokkaido and then to Sendai. So it's even though Sendai in the second movie is completely wiped off the fucking map, I mean, just that city doesn't exist anymore, seemingly nobody was killed. Is sort of what that movie implies, which is not realistic, obviously. I don't care how good of an evacuation effort you have. You're not clearing Tokyo, or the central area of Tokyo, of every single man, woman, and child that is there. People are going to stay behind for one reason or another. And so I like the way that this movie looks at that, says Gamera is not just a good guy, right? Gamera has a lot of similarities to Superman, but Gamera is not Superman, right? Gamera isn't a human, and he's not even humanoid. And so the question of how much is Gamera on our side versus how much is Gamera on the Earth side is a question in all these films. And this is the one that makes the biggest point of being like, ultimately, at the end of the day, you know, Gamera does not want to wipe out humanity, but Gamera's not desperately trying to make sure that every single person survives. You know, his goal is ultimately bigger than all of that. And you have to kind of understand that, like, you need to be able to put aside your personal issues around those things if you're dealing with something that is on such a huge scale as something like climate change or whatever. Like, there is a bigger issue here that you need to have that bigger adult, more mature perspective of, to have that like true understanding of things, which I think is part of the point of this third movie, and have to be able to work through whatever your personal grief or trauma is, because there's a larger fight happening. And Gamera is the one leading that larger fight that we ultimately need to kind of see and get behind. And I just think the way that the movie sort of navigates this much more complicated story, it's so much more, there's so much more going on with the plot and the themes and the messaging going on with the third one than there are in the first and the second. And it is, I think, the most rewarding movie of the three to rewatch, because there's a lot happening there, I think, with what the movie's kind of playing with and how it complicates its own message and the kind of iconography of the first two films.
Yeah, I completely agree. I honestly think it's kind of stunning how fully it gets into the idea. Because one of the things here was, when I watched the first movie with my brother, he was bothered a little bit by Gamera smashing all those buildings.
Uh-huh.
And, like, I didn't really think of it much. And I bet you probably have a similar feeling with this, Sean, because I've seen more of these movies, and it just happens. You know, he's a big fucking turtle. The buildings are not made for him. He can't walk through the streets perfectly. You know, he's doing what he can. But, like, Thomas was a little bothered, like, yeah, he's saving the people, but he's also, like, there must have been someone in that building. And I think it's interesting that the third movie... It's rare. It's very rare for a series to do something like that and then acknowledge it, you know? Mm-hmm. Like, to be like, well, yeah, let's interrogate that idea and not just create a straw man about it or something, or just like fully do what you were noting of like it's a very comic booky kind of thing. It was just like, we evacuated the whole city or something like that. And so I think,
look, I can see their parachutes kind of thing.
Yes, absolutely. That is a reference to the original Dragon Ball Z dub from Cartoon Network. Anyway, but this movie, like, confronts it head on. It makes, like, our POV protagonist is the girl who lost her family, and she is the protagonist for the whole movie. We do bring back the Nagamine character from the first movie, and she is kind of our other main character in this film. But we are really rooted, especially in that first half, to the Ayana character and everything she lost and her rage. And we even have, like, the big first act battle in this movie when Gamera, where are they when they're fighting at the beginning of the movie? It's Shibuya. Yeah,
they're in Shibuya, because you have the one shot of the dog statue, the Hachi, that gets fucking like doused in fucking Gamera fire.
Yeah, and like, it's not that Gamera is doing anything all that different from his other appearances, but we're seeing it, like, the framing there, and this is just damn good filmmaking, is very different from how Gamera is framed in the other films. Like, what kinds of shots are we using? Where are we in relation to the monsters? There's less of the camera at the scale of the monsters and more on the scale of the people on the street. And it's very effective in giving us this sense of fear, and it creates this question that is raised throughout the movie of, because at the end of the second movie, Asaki's like charm that connects her to Gamera breaks.
Yes.
And so there's this question in this movie is Gamera's connection to humanity severed? And that is a live question throughout, because Asaki has empathy for Gamera, but she has no connection to him anymore. She has no psychic link. And so that is a live question. And the way that is answered in the climax of Gamera risking everything to, you know, fucking rip Ayana out of the body of Iris, which is like such an amazing visual moment, and like show that, yes, Gamera has other priorities. Gamera has a bigger like calling here, but there is an answer to that question. It's really well structured. I think the movie has some like kind of dead ends, like the whole thing with the video game she plays on the Dreamcast, which is basically the plot of the Three Body Problem, if you've read that book or seen that show, which is this video game that is simulating the problem humanity has to confront. And I think the whole thing with like the villainous dude and his like the lady who's helping him and all of that, I think some of that is like so vestigial that it feels a little distracting. But overall, I think the macro structure of the movie, of starting with Ayana and that fear, and then figuring out what to do in the climax to answer that question, and then ending on it's not a cliffhanger because thematically it is so resolved, but like this moment of like it's evocative. It's the story does continue when the credits roll. It's stunning. There's no movie I've seen that is quite like Gamera 3 other than Batman v Superman, which is terrible. And so like it's amazing.
It's definitely completely unlike any other giant monster movie. I think tonally the only one that's a little similar to this in some ways is Godzilla vs. Destroya, which is the last of the Heisei era Godzilla movies. Partially it's like that being the last of that, and intentionally in that instance the last of that continuity of Godzilla movies. There's a finality to the conclusion and the sense of like we're trying to say something bigger about what this series of movies is. That has some shades of Gamera 3. And also that movie is notably darker than the other ones, like Gamera 3 here, which is very dark. Like the tone of this movie. It's horror.
Like it's definitely got some intersections with J-horror, like the late 90s, early 2000s, that kind of stuff starting. Like you can feel it in the air of this movie.
Like the tone of Gamera 3 is very intense and very oppressive. So it's like there are shades of like, you can see other giant monster movies that have elements that are a little similar to Gamera 3, but unlike Gamera 1 and 2, where I can point to a lot of giant monster movies that have lots of very obvious similarities, because Gamera 1 and 2 are not trying to be unusual as giant monster movies, they're just trying to be exceptional as them. This one is, I think, going somewhere else. Like, I feel like Kaneko and crew, they obviously, I think, know that Gamera 2 just was not quite as good as Gamera 1, and I think trying to approach the problem years later, right? Because keep in mind, Gamera 2 was made basically at the same time as Gamera 1, or like started production while Gamera 1 was finishing. This one, that they've got a little bit more time to sort of reflect on the whole thing and what they want to do with it, and kind of come to this very different place. And yeah, there's like a few things that I really want to zoom in with this movie. One of them is the scene in Shibuya, where I like that this movie sort of like feels like it kind of calls out the bullshit of the previous two, of like that the places where Gamera fights having been perfectly evacuated is a cop-out. And it's an obvious cop-out. It's a way to not have to deal with the question of, is there somebody in that building when Gamera stomps through it? And the movie just gives you an convenient way to say, no, there isn't. And it's a little bit like Ultraman in that way, where Ultraman, being such a like kind of kid-focused series, does not dwell on that like inherently Ultraman fighting these giant monsters, being as big as he is. If you're thinking about it realistically, it is impossible to buy the idea that Ultraman has not accidentally stepped on someone. Like, that has to have happened. Like, it's just impossible for it not to have. But those shows want you to just sort of accept this understanding of like, Ultraman would have known, and there's no way he would, I don't care, he would never have stepped on someone. It's just never happened. It can never happen. It's like the rules of Ultraman as a series. Like, Ultraman will break, or it will become something notably different if you even broach the fucking question. And here, I think that would be fairly true of some of the old Gamera movies, but I think the Heisei Gamera movies have such a different tone that they can, as this movie proves, withstand that question and withstand that level of interrogation and say, well, let's cut out that excuse. Let's say that it didn't get evacuated, that we didn't know that this fight was going to happen here, and we had no forewarning, and it's just like humanity is, in the crossfire of a war that they don't understand and cannot touch and cannot deal with. And it's a war that they've precipitated by creating the environment in which it happens. But like, this is a battle between two godlike figures, the Gamera and these new Gauss. And we just have to sit there and kind of experience it, and because you can't run away, and you can't fight it, that war, you just have to be victims of it, basically. And yeah, it's like a brutal scene. Like, you just have shots where Gamera's fireball, like, Gauss dodges it, and it hits a city street, and you see people get thrown up into the air. I think the most pointed moment in that scene, and like the most powerful, is you have an echo of the bridge scene from the first movie, where there's a little boy on the ground who's crying. And Gamera steps in the way and protects him from getting hit by Gauss's laser. And then at the end of that scene, after a whole lot of other destruction happens, where Gamera like ends up stepping on a subway station and people get crushed and all this awful shit happens, you've got this one shot where the mom comes back over to the little kid who's now kind of like, under this rubble, but he's fine. And the kid's crying, but he says, "Gamera saved me, mommy. Gamera saved me." And it's very similar to that scene on the bridge, but now it feels contextually very different, because it's like, yeah,
it's a really striking moment.
Yeah. Gamera saved you. But Gamera didn't save that person. That person, like the hundreds, or like if they say like 15 to 20,000 people were killed in that attack, as the news report says afterwards. It's like, Gamera's the guardian of children, and he's the guardian of the universe. But he's not the guardian of every person, right? He's not the guardian of every like adult person. Like that's not what he's there for. He's going to try to avoid harming children in any way, shape, or form. And then obviously he has his whole war with the Gauss because he's trying to save the whole biosphere of the Earth, not just the human race. And I think that that's just such a powerful scene where it is so horrifying, but you're also kind of like left trying to question what is Gamera and what is his like larger motive and what is our like the place of humanity within that. And then of course you're also sort of like, as a more adult viewer, you're like transplanting those ideas onto the thematic ideas of like environmentalism that are happening at the same time. That's part of the fabric of these films. It's just a very thought-provoking way to get into this. And I love the way that scene starts also is so great because you have our one cop dude who went to the fucking Bayer Factory in movie 2. Now he's a homeless guy living on the streets of Shibuya, and he looks up and just sees this ball of light. And then it like illuminates this large bird-like figure, and you realize, oh shit, it's going down. And like the way they do the fireball effects and like it like illuminates the sky, it's so good. And it just feels like, it's like, a shot of like someone living in a city, and then the missiles just come raining down, basically. It's really, really interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's... Again, like I said, it's very striking. It's amazing to see the movie go there. It's amazing to see the movie kind of auto-critique the other movies. I mean, that's something that I think is a cool potentiality of serial filmmaking or television or something like this. But I think it's very rarely embraced. It's, it is a striking thing that Batman v Superman tries to address the criticisms of Man of Steel. I don't think it really does, in part because that movie also ends with a scene where they're like, we evacuated everybody, it's okay. And it's like, you can't do that. Your beginning of your movie was about how that's not possible. You can't, like, if Gamera 3 did that at the end, that would feel like a cop-out. And so I really do think it's something that, movies like this can do, but so rarely do, that it's amazing to see how far it goes with it.
Yeah, it's awesome. And then you have, one of the other things I really want to zoom in on Gamera 3 is the way the plot is structured in the first half. I think is really fascinating because it intentionally mirrors the first half of the first movie, right? So you've got Nagamine, who is the bird scientist from movie 1, she is investigating the reappearance of Gauss all over the planet, right? So the thing that the sort of first movie suggests could happen in the future, that there are other Gauss eggs out there, and as the environment worsens, they will start waking up. Like that has now come to pass. There's kind of this almost apocalyptic vibe that is the movie sets up as Nagamine is investigating all of those things. And then you've got, on the flip side, you've got our other plot line with Ayana, right? And so this in some ways mirrors Nagamine in the first movie investigating the Gauss stuff. And then you've got Asagi and her family that are part of the Gamera plot line. And then in that movie, they intersect when Gamera kind of comes in and fucks up everything at the stadium. Well, here you've got those two sort of parallel plot lines, but I love there's this very disorienting thing they do that's disorienting on purpose, where the plot lines intersect at a point that is very surprising and strange to the viewer, because you've got all the stuff with Ayana, and she's gone to the cave, she's found Iris, she started to raise it, and then you have this very eerie scene where she is sort of absorbed by Iris, and then the boy has to go and save her. And so you're at that point in that storyline. You then cut to the Nagamine side of the story and continue on with that, where now it's like, oh, we've got these other appearance of like a giant monster that's attacked this village. We're going to go investigate it. And they go to this village and they go into this ruined house. And then Nagamine looks on the ground and sees the picture of Ayana in her family. And so that is the moment at which you, as the viewer, realize, oh, we are in her house from that side of the story. And it's such a strange way to intersect those two plot lines, because there's this clear gap where you have like missed like a whole important thing in a way that I feel like movies would not have done this. Like they would have set up the idea that house would have been destroyed before you cut to this thing to make that a natural lead-in. But it's meant to be a surprise and shock to the viewer that whole set of supporting characters of her adoptive family, they're fucking dead, and they're like these like fucking zombified corpses that have had their life energy sucked out of them. And it's like got a whole horror jump scare where the one like adoptive mother's body falls and hangs down from the ceiling, and you have that like Evil Dead mummified corpse thing right in your eyes. And that's where like you just get this very intense, sharp shock to the whole shape and structure of the movie, where that whole intersection point of the two plot lines has been sort of like circumvented in some way. And then critically, the sequence that happens that would have been the connective tissue that leads you to this is how these two things connect together, which is Iris going in and killing all those people, is taken out of that moment, and instead it's put into the climax of the movie where Ayana realizes that's what happens. She has that vision when she's been absorbed by Iris again and sees that moment of her in the form of Iris killing her whole family, and realizes like sort of the consequences of the hatred she has harbored in her for the whole film. Like that's such a like bold, strange way to structure the film and sort of to shake up the way that sort of parallel plotline thing works by having all the breadcrumbs be like the first movie and set up like the first movie, but instead just sharply interject into that Iris plotline and have the Gauss Gamera one just be there all of a sudden, and you had no idea that now we are all like everything is kind of come together. It's such an interesting, strange way to have those plot lines intersect. But I think it's one of the things that gives this movie its very unique sort of idiosyncratic tone and that very dark apocalyptic energy where things are falling apart before you even realize that they have fallen apart.
I'm really glad you brought this up because I completely agree about that, and it's very striking. And last night I was watching this movie pretty late at night, and I thought I might have like split it in half and finish it this morning because I'd been watching Game 2 of the World Series, and anyway, I had a long day, and then I was watching this. But I got to, and I was getting tired, and then I got to that point in the movie, and I kind of put it, I'm like, what the fuck is going on? Like, they're in this house, like, what happened? And it's just this, like, not that the movie is, like, sagging or anything, but it's this injection of, like, where is this going? And from there on to the end, I was very locked in of figuring it out, because it is a really striking left turn that I think builds to the conclusion in Kyoto, which is just fucking astonishing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another thing in this whole section I wanted to mention is about the special effects in this movie are the rockiest because they have the most CGI, which I do understand for some of those shots because like they want to do things with Iris that you can't do with a costume. But I will say when Iris is like the little baby that she is like working with, that is an incredible animatronic.
Yes.
That thing looks unreal. Holy crap. Like it's both eerie and gross, but also like it is so tactile. It is like so arrestingly real. It freaks you out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like the effects for little baby Iris and then the full-grown one are pretty good. The full-grown one has a little bit more of the CGI stuff, but I think it looks better there. There's that kind of like mid-stage one that looks pretty rough and very 90s CGI. Although I think the movie gets away with it enough because the creature's supposed to be so eerie and otherworldly that like the CGI stuff doesn't bother as much as if they're trying to do that and it was a Gauss and it was just a giant bird, but it looked very goofy. Here, like, at least it's supposed to be so alien and weird. This is the one, like, Iris is the most kind of, like, I don't know, like, kind of Lovecraftian of all the monsters, where it's almost kind of formless. You don't have the sort of, like, clear, it's a bird, it's a bug. Like, you don't have that sort of template to place it onto. It's so different where it's got certain design cues from the Gauss, but it's got these like giant tentacles as well, and it sort of has more of that kind of almost cyborg-like quality where, you know, all of these things, Gamera, the Gauss, they're all artificial lives and artificial life forms. This is the one that feels the most like, oh, this is clearly not organic. Like it is this weird sort of cobbled together thing from all these different parts that has been created as a sort of like super version of whatever the Gauss are.
Yeah, absolutely. It's incredible. It's very cool. I think the only problem with the CGI, or it would be a problem if there were moments where like you felt like, oh, they could have done this another way, but I never had that feeling.
Yeah.
I think that's why they get it. And that's kind of what you were saying. That's how they get away with it, is that when they're using the CGI, it's like, okay, I understand why they had to use it here, and that's why it works. But then also, you get to the finale, and I think it also doesn't matter because the finale is so practical. Like, they've built some incredible, like, again, calling it miniatures feels wrong. It's miniature compared to an entire city, but it looks like a whole soundstage particularly for Kyoto Station, which is where the whole climax takes place. That is a mix of sets that they have built, real-world locations where they've had, extras run through to act like they're running from the monsters, and then also the models and the miniature work that they have. But there's a bunch of locations in Kyoto. Like, if you've been anywhere near or around Kyoto, you will recognize every spot that they're going to, and it's part of the horror of the scene, is it's meant to be like everyone knows these places. And then you have the whole finale inside Kyoto Station, and yeah, it's the stuff that, because Iris as a suit looks so good at that point. Gamera, this is, as you said, this is like Gamera's, goth glow up that he has had in between movies, and he looks great. The fight is so good, and Gamera's action movie finale moment of blowing off his own arm to then go in and save Ayana is the, like, most awesome action hero thing ever. Like, I half expected Gamera to go, yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker, as he does that, because it is so good. He is a John Woo hero. He is a, Bruce Willis hero. He is just every fucking, like, cop on the edge. It's so good. I fucking love Gamera here. It's great. We need a Superman movie where Superman has to, like, use his eyes to, like, blow off his own arm. That's awesome. It's great.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, he gets his very, like, Christ-like moments here where he gets impaled in the side with the giant, like, spear-like thing, and then he gets impaled in the hand, so he's got, like, Gamera stigmata. But I think I would have maybe, like, found the, like, Christian teachings more palatable to my taste if, in the mythology, after Christ was put on the cross, he's like, fuck, and he cut off his own hand, and then went and he fought the Romans, and it's like, I'm just gonna go fuck your shit up, like, fuck you guys. He replaces his hand with, like, a cook or some shit and became a pirate. It's like, that would have been, if I, like, 8-year-old Sean, who was, like, taken to a church when he had a sleepover at a friend's house and wasn't even realize that was going to happen, and I was like, this is weird, I don't know why all this is happening, I would have maybe been like, oh, fuck, yeah, sure, like, I'll come here again, if that's the kind of stuff that's going on. Yeah, it's that whole climax, it's incredible. As you say, like, it's so brutal what happens to Gamera. Like, it's really fucked up. It's that kind of thing where it's like, the way they show it is so intense and so gory and bloody that, like, if you imagined that being a human character, like, it's so fucked.
Oh, yeah.
It'd be like a super hard R horror movie is the only time you're going to see something like that happen to a human character. Yeah, that he blows off his own hand, he, like, absorbs the weird, like, fire energy or whatever that Iris shoots, that's, like, Iris got from Gamera, and then blows Iris up. After he's ripped Ayana out of the guts of Iris. It's so good, but, like, I think one of the other things that makes that whole finale so powerful is you have all that stuff going on, but then it's also intercut with, like, the drama of Ayana coming to terms with all of this happening and her floating inside of Iris and, like, really realizing, like, right, like, there's a bigger thing that is happening here, that, like, my own traumas and my, like, hatred is so selfish and it's so self-centered, and I've only ever seen the world in that way, and it's had this bigger consequence that she sacrificed and led to the deaths of so many people as a result. And I love that there's just, like, a simple thing where you see the flashback again of her seeing Gamera running through the building, and they don't do the thing that I feel like another movie would have done of, like, her, like, she remembered it wrong and Gamera wasn't really responsible for her family. It's like, no, Gamera killed her family, but then she also remembers the part where she turns around and sees Gauss is right there too. And it's like, right, there's a bigger context to this, and it's awful and terrible that her family died, but they didn't die for nothing or for no reason. Like, there's a larger thing happening here. There's a bigger context in which you live, and you have to be able to see that larger context if you want to be able to become, like, an adult and improve the world. And I think that's, like, I don't think, like, the movie never tells you those things, but just by showing you that context and having her have the revelation in that way, it allows the movie to feel very authentically about the things it's about. It never says that Gamera did not kill her family. It never says that Gamera didn't kill the people in Shinjuku or Shibuya when Gamera came down. But it is saying that, like, those are things that are happening because there is a larger battle. There's a larger war happening here, like, literally in the movie, for us, like in our battle in environmentalism, wherever you want to like sort of project that onto, that is literally a battle, an existential one, is one that determines the future of that entire species, if not also potentially like the larger biosphere of Earth. And so you need to be able to understand that like you sit on a certain side in that battle, and you can't let personal grievances cause you to fight for the other side just because, even if those grievances are real and authentic, like the greater good is a real thing and it's worth fighting for. And I feel like that's kind of part of her lesson of growing up that she has in that moment, and why Gamera has to save her. Because she is one of the people that can help affect that change for the future. And so Gamera will do, because she is still young, he will do everything possible to try to save her life, and then do the other most badass action movie thing ever, where there's an entire fucking flock of like 100 Gauss descending on Kyoto, and he fucking flies up to go get them because the fight is never going to be over. And Gamera is not going to give up, as Asagi tells us at the end of the movie.
Agree with all of that, but I also think like part of what makes the movie so good and mature is that it does not end on an easy note. Like true as all of that is, it does not end with her going, Gamera, you really were a hero. I love you, Gamera. And like him going off with like triumphal music. They don't have like a Gamera theme song as he flies to go fight the Gauss or anything like that. Like, it's dark. The last word of the movie is this pan across all the characters and Ayana going, Gamera. But she says it in this way that like is still ambivalent. Like, she has come to accept his place, but that doesn't mean she has forgotten her own pain or any of these difficult things. And I think all the characters and the audience have a more complicated relationship with Gamera at the end of this movie than they did coming in.
Yes.
Hers is more complicated because it's not pure hatred anymore, but like Asagi's is also more complicated because it is not just like this, because she viewed Gamera as almost like this kind of god figure or something, that she was attached to. And I think they all know that it is messier and more complicated. I think all those questions it's raising, it feels like the movie pays them their due because it takes it seriously and doesn't resolve on an easy note. And it has this, as you say, the fight goes on ending, but this could be the apocalypse of Japan. I mean, is what we're about to see. Who the hell knows? Gamera could go, he very well might die and wind up in that Gamera graveyard in this fight. But like, I think it leaving on a note where the audience is forced to grapple with it and walk out of the theater or, turn off the movie and think about what they watched. It's unresolved both narratively and thematically a little bit. Thematically in that it's very much shown us Gamera's place, and that is resolved. But in resolving it, it has brought up more questions that we then need to go reflect on. And that is something very few movies are capable of doing. And that is something that makes, even though there are messy bits of this movie, I think on the whole it is an absolute triumph, because I think it's very rare you see a movie like this that leaves you kind of both this resolved and unresolved in really productive ways.
Yeah, because I think this movie just sort of, it has it's taking a much bigger bite than the other movies of like, what is it trying to handle? What is like its mission statement for itself? And this the kind of thing it's trying to do is just not, you can't make a movie trying to do this that is as sort of like perfect as as Gamera 1. Like, it's just too much. And it doesn't have, as you say, like nothing about it is sort of like easy or simple. So it's like the unresolved nature of the ending, the fact that it's like, it's not about Gamera has defeated all of his foes and then will roar triumphantly as he goes back into the sea. Like, that ending cannot happen in this movie, or if you tried to do it, it would feel very inauthentic. And there are other movies that are like that, where it's like they raise all these things, but then it still has your big triumphant ending at the end and tries to pretend that like, oh, well, we just don't have to worry about those problems. And yeah, there's something that's very powerful about it, willing to just say, nope, like he's going to go off to fight those Gauss. And like, realistically, he would lose. I mean, I believe that Gamera would win because he's Gamera, but like, he has been fucking impaled through the chest. He has blown his own fucking arm off. He's been pretty fucked up in this fight with Iris, and we've seen that, it's hard. Like, the Gauss are not an easy foe, and there's like 100 of them or whatever. Like, there's like, I love that shot where you've got all the stuff of like the military, kind of getting these like signals or whatever intercut with the sort of, climax of the Gamera stuff. And then you realize, oh, it's not them like trying to go fuck up Gamera more or something like that. It's like, no, they have picked up all these Gauss, and then you get that shot and there's a few of them, and then there's more and more and more, and then like the whole screen is just filled and there's like 100 of them. And you realize, okay, like the apocalypse is basically here. It's like it is the day of reckoning basically, and I guess maybe one thing that is different between Gamera and Jesus Christ is Gamera is really going to fight for humanity's side. Jesus is up there. Gamera's here with us, man. He's on planet Earth, and he ain't leaving any of that shit behind.
I do want to see the Jesus Christ biopic movie that takes its inspiration from Gamera, that, when he gets to the point on the cross, why, God, have you forsaken me? And he, rips his own arm off and goes off to fight Pontius Pilate. It'd be pretty great.
It'd be pretty good.
Boy, we're going to hell. Anyway, Sean, this is a great movie, great trilogy. What else do we need to say about our friend, our savior, our Lord, Gamera the Turtle?
All I really want to say is I'm very happy. Finally, we got to talk about these movies. It's been a long, long time coming. I'm glad that you watched them and have very much enjoyed them. And, that he is our Lord, he is our Savior, and he also is the absolute guardian of the universe.